This conference will now be recorded.
All right. I call to order this meeting of the King George County Board of Supervisors.
Call to order the meeting of the King George Planning Commission.
All right, we'll start with any amendments to the agenda. Do we have any amendments to the agendas, Mr. Miller?
No, sir.
Okay, then we will move on to public comment. So I have a list of names. We're going to do it a little bit differently. Normally we have the podium, but since we have a circle here, trying to make it as easy as possible for everyone to be able to address all members of the board and the planning commission, we are going to move. There's a microphone up here, kind of at the dais. So if you could please use that one, I would appreciate it. So if you're here for public comment, I will read down the names first, and if you didn't sign in, we'll still have the opportunity after I go through the names. Please provide your name, your address, and please try to limit your comments to 3 minutes in order to afford everyone an opportunity to speak. So as I said, I'll start with the list. So I have Julie Edgar.
I can stand up higher. Hi, my name is Julie Edgar. I live at 4250 Stafford Lane, King George, Virginia. It's nice to see everybody so casual tonight. I just want to bring the Board of Supervisors and the Planning Committee together with what we want to do with the winery, because everybody seems to have different ideas. Basically, it's just we're going to purchase our ingredients, make them on site, sell them on site, let people taste them on site, let them purchase them on site, and perhaps have a couple of little bistro tables inside, have some music, just piped in radio music, and people can bring their own cheese and crackers if they want, or maybe we can supply cheese and crackers, but just very casual, nothing outside, no loud noises, no nothing. I mean, if where we find a place to put it, if it allows for maybe 2 bistro tables outside, that's fine too. Still, no noise outside, no music, just chatter. Barrels are 59 gallons. I believe you were questioning that. Wine barrels are 59 gallons. So that's, but that's pretty much all I have to say. It's just very simple, very easy, no noise ordinance, we're not going to be selling anybody else's products unless we purchase cheese and crackers and sell it there. No other alcoholic beverages, maybe bottled water and soda so people can have a designated driver for whatever reason, I'm not quite sure. Or maybe they just don't like wine, and that's fine too, and they're going with a friend. So just those little things, but just, just a nice little place to go for a couple of hours, and there's no muss, no fuss, and it would be fun. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Edgar. John Edgar.
She's a little shorter than I am. Hello, my name is John Edgar, 4250 Stafford Lane. I just want to say, first of all, thank you for everything that everybody's been doing for us with this. It's a slow process. We understand that. My wife did cover some of the points. I just, went over it pretty much in big detail last week with the Board of Supervisors meeting. But I just wanted to say thank you again.
Thank you, Mr. Edgar. Debbie Fairfax.
Debbie Fairfax, Kings Highway. Thank you for working to make solar, data centers, and noise ordinances more robust. We should not even consider applications for these until we have developed proper ordinances for them. The applicant should not be the one defining the standards through proffers. We can look at benchmark localities, but we need to wisely decide how these uses will be permitted here. With that in mind, let's discuss data centers. In Mecklenburg, the data center area is not yet at full build-out, but the building located closest to a data center using Google Earth measures more than 4/10 of a mile away. The buffer zone surrounding the Mecklenburg area look like original growth woods. There are no residences or schools nearby, nothing for nearly half a mile. That's not the case here. In Prince William, Data Center Dynamics, a data center industry publication, explains in a March 2nd, 2023 article titled, Prince William County Officials Seek to Amend Noise Regulations for Data Centers. County Board of Supervisors looking to increase noise mitigation requirements. In summary, the article says, officials are to explore amending the county's noise regulations around data centers, potentially paving the way for more stringent noise reduction requirements for facilities. The Design Construction Standards Manual and Zoning Ordinances Amendment process will allow county officials to consider noise mitigation measures such as noise walls and other noise reducing measures and noise studies. The board also amended the noise ordinance as part of the county code to remove the commercial HVAC exemption from the nighttime maximum permissible sound pressure levels. A board's not going to do that for a non-issue. On October 6, 2022, Data Center Dynamics and Data Center Frontier reported that the Loudoun Board of Supervisors voted on September 20th that the only places data centers would be allowed by right in a county extremely experienced with data centers would be suburban industrial mineral extraction, transition light industrial, and industrial mineral extraction. I contacted the Loudoun Department of Building and Development on September 27th. One of the reasons was noise. This doesn't seem to align with Berkeley's use permission data. I don't know why, but Loudoun is obviously working to update their data center regs and rules as well. Rulers and their rules hold no terror for those who do right. So having good noise standards in place should be no issue to those who don't have loud data centers. If data centers come, they should come quietly, but we must have the standards in place that make that happen. Every person in this room wants to be able to get in bed and not hear noise that makes us unable to sleep. As far as wants go, you don't get much more basic than that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fairfax. Todd Fairfax.
Todd Fairfax, 623 Kings Highway. Good evening. First, I'd like to thank the board for funding Change Order 1. We're grateful for the second look. The additional time and money will be well worth the effort to protect the citizens by making sure we get these matters correct from the start. I'd like to share with you something that has become a very common practice. In fact, it's become so common it's practically standard operating procedure. And it's very pertinent to tonight's conversation. It's been called science for hire. Here's how it works. Corporations know that in order to satisfy certain regulatory requirements imposed by governing bodies, independent third-party scientific studies are needed to legitimize claims of meeting those regulatory requirements. So the corporation hires a third-party scientific company with proper credentials to perform a study. The corporation obtains the results, and if the results are what the corporation wants in order to meet the regulatory requirements, the results are submitted to the governing body. However, if the results are not what the corporation wants, they bury the results. Those results never see the light of day, and the corporation moves on to find another company that will give them the desired results. Now, with desired results in hand, the corporation supplies those results to the governing body, supposedly demonstrating that the regulatory requirements are met and proceeds forward, even though the requirements are not met. This is, in fact, not science for hire, but fraud for hire. Nowhere in this process is truth the desired outcome for the corporation. The noise standard being discussed tonight requires applicants for rezoning, special exception, or site plan applications to conduct a noise analysis prepared by qualified and credentialed professionals to demonstrate that the requirements for noise will be met. Then, initial and annual testing for noise compliance requires the applicant to utilize a qualified and credentialed professional for the testing. Both of these provisions are great protections for the citizens. Thank you for them. What protections will you put in place to prevent fraudulent science from being used to satisfy these important noise protections? I recommend you codify in the noise standards that the zoning administrator shall engage an independent, credentialed professional unaffiliated with the applicant or its agents, paid for as part of the fees assessed to the applicant, to produce an independent assessment of the noise analysis or noise testing to verify the truthfulness and accuracy of the applicant's results. If the fox promises sincerely from the bottom of his heart that he will well guard the hen house and protect the hens, will you believe him? Thank you for your attention and action.
Thank you, Mr. Fairfax. Coons Campbell.
Hello, my name is Kuntz Campbell. I live at Vernon Woods. I'm referring to the short-term rental situation. The short-term rental situation that has been proposed. I spoke with the zoning department, with Lewis there, and I asked him how many calls the sheriff's office has gotten because of noisy short-term rentals. They do not know because the rentals aren't registered. I asked him how many affordable housing units had been lost because contractors were unable to buy the short-term rentals. They do not know because they aren't all registered. I asked how many communities have become transient because of short-term rental. They do not know because they are not registered. How many of them have caused parking and trash problems? They do not know because they have not been registered. In other words, the Planning Commission is being asked to make rules for problems we don't even know that we have. We're going to tell people what they can do with their private property, that they can't do short-term rentals because some company from somewhere else has decided that they shouldn't be allowed to when we don't even know we have a problem. We're not losing affordable housing because of short-term rentals. I can promise you that. We've got a beach area, and I have a house there. I don't, but if I did, I could rent to people in the summer who would come to King George and spend their money. They only want to be there for a month or 6 weeks. We're not aware of any problems with that at all. I have a small house, maybe 1 or 2 bedroom in Dalgar. Somebody comes to train on the base. They want to rent. They're only going to be here for about 2 months. But I can't rent them my property because zoning or the planning, whomever is doing it, decided we couldn't do short-term rentals unless they're in our residence. There is absolutely no reason that anybody has given me that we should take this right away from our property owners. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Campbell. Nathan Solons.
Good evening. My name is Nathan Solons. I live at 6740 North Stewart Road. I'm speaking with you tonight on behalf of Mr. Ken Stroud pertaining to the restrictions of agricultural operations in the proposed King George zoning ordinance by the Berkeley Group. Currently, the proposed zoning ordinance table 6-1 use matrix has a meat processing facility under use by special exception only, not by right, conflicting with state code. Additionally, the ordinance includes section 7-2-6 meat processing facility, which is not required and conflicts with state policy. The slaughtering of livestock and meat processing, according to Virginia state code, are agricultural operations and are encouraged under the state policy 3.2-108.2, expansion of the Commonwealth slaughter and meat processing facilities, and protected by 3.2-301 right to farm restrictive ordinances. As such, they are covered under the county's agriculture's and civil cultures provisions. The first line in the proposed zoning ordinance use matrix table 6-1. And there is no need to list meat processing facility separately or to have the contents of section 7-2-6 meat processing facility, which contains several limitations on property owners in direct conflict with state code. This section must be removed from the county's ordinance. Please note, Virginia State Code 3.2-301, right to farm restrictive ordinances states no locality shall adopt any ordinance that requires that a special exception or a special use permit be obtained for any production, agriculture, or silviculture activity in an area that is zoned as an agricultural district or classification. Additionally, no locality shall enact zoning ordinances that would unreasonably restrict or regulate farm structures, or any farming or forestry practices in an agricultural district or classification unless such restrictions bear a relationship to the health, safety, general welfare of its citizens. The slaughter of livestock and meat processing are necessary means for ranchers and farmers to produce meat for their families and as a source of revenue which benefits them as well as the county. These are practices that have been performed here since the existence of the county, and to limit them without cause and in conflict with state policy diminishes our citizens' rights, limits their ability to feed their families and produce revenue due to the loss of the ability to sell their meat processed. We request that these sections are removed from the zoning ordinance to protect the rights, liberties of the King George citizens and to use their property and livestock as our God, our forefathers intended, to avoid conflicting with state law. The section 7-2-6 must be removed. It is in direct conflict with the Virginia state policy of encouraging agricultural operations, specifically encouraging, expanding, and developing slaughter and meat processing facilities. It goes so far as to limit the number of customers to 5 per day, and that no equipment trailers can be visible from the right-of-way. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Solons. Kyle West.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Kyle West. I'm here on behalf of Open Road Renewables, a national utility scale and battery storage development company. My address is 218 Knoll Farm Lane, Charlottesville, Virginia. First, I want to start by saying thank you all for your civic service. I have attended many, if not hundreds of meetings and work sessions. And I know your job can often be thankless, and it is like a serious time commitment. So really, thank you. I'm going to keep my comments brief as is necessary. If there is really one takeaway tonight that I want to make is we wholly support your effort on responsible land use. The only thing we're asking for is that our project not be proactively precluded. What I mean by that is we're asking that things not be put in the ordinance whereby you will never see our application. You'll never see the merits, the potential benefits of our project. That's all we ask. And there are some things that are proposed in the current draft ordinance that may make it such that you will never see a project. It could be that it's the ideal project for the county, but you'll never know it. 3 of those items in regard to the solar ordinance are the 500-acre limit on project size. It could be that those 500 acres or 501 acres are perfectly suited for that project and exactly where the county wants the solar project to be. The other is a requirement that all solar panels be within 1 mile of the transmission line. Seems quite arbitrary. And again, you can have arrays over a host of different parcels connected via easements, and then you would just never see it if it is 1.1 miles away. So the last one that we think could proactively preclude applicants is a limit of 65% of the lot with panels. So it could be that you have a landowner who just has land that is unproductive, they can't do much with. And here, you can only put 65% of the panels on it. You're limiting the revenue that they can get from the lease. And so we just are asking that we can show you the merits of our project, show you the potential benefits via the siting agreement that we'll negotiate. Let the process play out through the Planning Commission, the Board of Supervisor hearings, community meetings, site plan approval, comprehensive plan approval, siting agreement negotiation. So we would just ask again, please don't put anything in the ordinance that actively precludes the applicant. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. West. So that concludes the list of people who have actually signed up on the sheet. So if there's anyone that would like to speak, please feel free. Again, approach the podium, provide your name and address, and limit your comments to 3 minutes.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the Board of Supervisors and the Planning Commission. My name is Hobie Mitchell. I live in the village of Aldie, Virginia. And to the month, I'm a 60-year resident of the state of Virginia. I won't tell you how old when I moved in. So I'm here tonight. I am a managing partner of Green Energy Ventures, who's the applicant for King George Technology Center, which is a 345-acre data center, potentially water treatment facility and a power facility that I've been talking with the county. We currently have an application pending. So my comments are dealing with data centers. I think they should be by right in the industrial zone. You develop criteria that you want for noise, which you can't achieve. Technology has really been improved over the last few years. I know there's a history from some of the older data centers, but that's changed a lot drastically. In fact, many today don't even need water for cooling. There's an evolution to get away from that. I think for other districts like non-industrial districts that you can do that by special exception because there's other criteria you got to think about. But for the industrial zone, to make it clear and attract the end user who you want to be here, you should make it a by right with criteria. From noise, site constraints, all those different things. The other thing you have pending is trying to solve a water problem that you have in King George, getting off of groundwater. So we've been proactively trying to help solve that and working with the county and the state to try to figure out a way that King George can have a public water treatment facility to make sure that they have the water needs that they have in the future. And then lastly, we're working on hydrogen fuel. Our hydrogen power facilities, which we think will be the future. And so we hope to be proactive in providing that here as well. Thank you for your time. And one last comment. I think you have to rely on your engineers and professionals, especially those with seals, that they're going to be truthful and adequate in their results, whether you're a civil engineer, mechanical engineer, noise consultant, or anybody else. The county shouldn't you should have an approved list that they have, and it shouldn't be getting into the business of hiring all the people and managing all that. It's a lot of overhead to manage. You have to rely on the professional aspects of those consultants. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. Anyone else?
Good evening. My name is Janice Ray, and I live at 10438 Fletcher's Chapel Road. My home and property are directly across the street from the proposed development with Birchwood power plants. I come here tonight with several concerns. First, my family and I moved here to King George at the end of 2021 because of the beautiful rural setting. We have 2 young children and desired a home that was free of crime, pollution, and the noise of city or industrial living. I ask as a King George County resident who is directly affected by these potential developments to please establish ordinances before any proposals are considered, and to remember that King George residents are asking that those ordinances protect us from undue noise. Second, as previously stated, my family moved here for the beautiful rural setting. I ask that ordinances be established to protect the natural landscape of our county. We moved here from Baltimore, Maryland, as my husband works in downtown Washington, D.C., so that we could raise our children somewhere away from the concrete jungle. Since this development has been discussed, we've had many conversations if King George is still right for our family. Those concerns are wrapped around what our view from our front porch will look like, how the traffic on Fletcher's Chapel will change, and whether the noise levels will affect the quiet, peaceful life we once sought here. Third, I ask that you please remember the comprehensive plan established by the county and serve the residents of your county. and not your own personal agendas, interests, or wallets. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ray. Do we have anyone else that would like to provide public comment here? Mr. Dines, do we have anyone online who would like to provide public comment?
No, Mr. Chairman.
Did anyone from the board or from the Planning Commission receive any correspondence to be entered into the record? Okay. In that case, we will close public comment and we will move on to presentation by the Berkeley Group.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the board. Thanks so much for having me here. My name is Tori Haynes. I'm a planner with the Berkeley Group, and hopefully joining us through virtually is Rebecca Cobb, Deputy Director of Planning for the Berkeley Group. And if Rebecca's available, she'll actually get the presentation started.
Yeah, I'm available.
Great, okay. Hi, Rebecca.
Hello, Tori. Hello, Planning Commission, Board of Supervisors. Sorry I'm not with you in the room tonight. I was feeling under the weather today and thought it best that I keep my distance and do this virtually. So thank you for your patience for that. But tonight I would like to just kind of go through the process to date. How did we get to this point where we are now? And then we are going to dive into looking at solar facilities, data centers, and noise. You asked us to research all of those, and we have done that research and come up with some additional recommendations. And Tori is going to be leading you through the discussion of those items, and then I'll close up with our next steps after that. I will say these are meaty topics, and so we have tried our best to just be really concise about what we looked at, what we saw, and then what our recommendations are. And so I think to make it through all of it tonight, I'll just ask that you all be really efficient too in your discussion and coming to consensus in terms of providing us with direction of what you want us to edit and change in the upcoming draft that will be complete. So just keep that in mind as we move forward. In terms of what's been completed so far, we completed investigation and public engagement. That included reviewing your existing documents, reaching out to the public through surveys and workshops and special sessions. And then we went into drafting with the Planning Commission. And you can see in the middle column there that we've got the first draft is complete, but based on our work session tonight and the next work session that we will have, there may be some changes within the articles for use matrix, use performance standards, and community design standards. So based on what you decide over those two meetings, it may affect that draft document. And then after we've come to consensus on those items, we'll move into the adoption phase of this project. Next slide. This is just another look at the process. As I mentioned, we did the community input where we had the surveys, stakeholder interviews, and public workshop. And then we went into drafting with the Planning Commission. We took articles to them at work sessions. They provided us with comments and edits. We incorporated those and then would return again with additional materials. And so now we've gotten kind of to the end of that drafting where it's joint review and refinement. We met at the beginning of the year with you all, discussed the first draft, and highlighted where your left concerns are and where we should move from that. Once we kind of refine and discuss these items, we're going to move into the public review. So after your edits are incorporated, we'll put the full draft out for public review, have a public open house to receive comments and concerns, ideas, questions, all of those sorts of things. We'll collect all of that information and bring it back to you for final drafting. So we'll have 2 additional work sessions with you all to present to you what we hear from the public, let you all discuss that, come up with any additional edits that you want for the ordinance, and then we would move into adoption, where again, there's chance for the public to participate through public hearings. Next slide. So just as a reminder, we talked about this last time we met, but the ordinance was drafted basing it on the Code of Virginia, making sure it reflects Code of Virginia requirements, as well as takes advantage of optional items within the Code of Virginia. We did reorganize the ordinance quite a bit, tried to streamline and simplify language as much as possible. And then we also based it on public engagement from that initial phase, as well as our staff discussions. We've had lots of discussions with staff, getting their direction on items, and then also through the Planning Commission when we submitted materials to them. Next slide. And so last time we were with you, there were industrial uses that were still of concern and questions about what's in the ordinance regarding data center, battery storage, power plants, solar, and noise related to industrial uses. And just as a reminder, we had work sessions on those last year in May and July, and where those were kind of left at that point, where data center was a special exception in general trade and industrial light district, and then by right and industrial district, and there were use standards provided. Solar, there are 3 levels of solar within the ordinance, so a small scale, medium scale, and utility scale. And the allowance of those varies based on the scale, so both by right and special exception, depending on the scale and the districts that it's allowed in. And then battery energy storage facility is by right in the industrial district and has use standards. Utility service major is a use, and this is what would include power plants, and it's a special exception in all districts. Staff continued to review, provided us with additional comments through September and December of last year. And then we heard from you all that you wanted us to explore further. So next slide, please. So through that additional research, you asked us to look at American Planning Association, as well as other communities that you selected to compare to. And so we've done that, and we've provided you with recommendations looking at what's currently been drafted, and then what can be edited, or what we recommend to be edited within that. And Tori is going to discuss those items with you, let you provide feedback, and then from your consensus, we will edit the text as directed. And so tonight we are discussing data centers, solar facilities, and noise limits. And then in our next meeting, we will continue with the other 2 topics. So with that, I'll hand it over and let Tori take over discussion items.
All right, thank you. So as Rebecca said, we do have some pretty meaty topics tonight. What we'll do is give you an overview, sort of highlights of the research, highlights of the benchmark communities. We'll go through our recommendations, and then we'll have a chance to discuss those and get everyone's feedback, rinse and repeat for each topic. So we'll start with solar. Just some basics here. Solar is the fastest growing energy source in the world. Facility sizes range from small rooftop systems to large ground mounted solar farms. Utility scale is generally the largest. It supplies power to the grid. Size varies, but roughly it's about 6 to 8 acres per megawatt. Lifespan is around 40 years with the current technology. Some land use considerations for solar farms, in particular the larger scale ones. Your changes in the use currently or the future land use, so thinking your rural parcels, but also your growth areas, your residentially designated parcels, your industrially designated parcels, seeing if that's a good fit for solar. Location, is it compatible with the surrounding area? Environmental impacts, things like impervious surface, clearing and grading, and erosion implications, wildlife corridors, and vegetation. visual impacts, particularly near historic and cultural resources, and then at the end of the life of the facility, the decommissioning plan. It is important to have some standards there, some decommissioning plan requirements, and then to keep track of those for the life of the facility so it can be enforced at the end of it. The communities that were chosen for reviewing solar were Essex County and Spotsylvania County. Both do have solar-specific ordinances, slightly different approaches. In Essex, we have multiple scales of facilities defined, similar to what we're proposing for King George. They actually have a few more, whereas Spotsylvania, all scales of facilities are defined under the one definition of solar energy facility. The use permissions, small scale facilities in Essex are by right, medium scale. It's a mix of by right and conditional use, and the largest scales of facilities are conditional use in any district. Spotsylvania also has limited districts where they're allowed and special use in all of those. Site area, Essex does scale it depending on the type of facility and the scale of that facility. So similar to what we're proposing here in King George, with small scale having no minimum or maximum because they could be rooftop, medium, large, and utility scale all gradually going up with the size of the facility. Spotsylvania, what we could find was that non-ag uses, the minimum is 2 acres in the underlying zoning districts. Setbacks in Essex, again, it scales with the facility, so ranges from the underlying zoning district setbacks up to specified setbacks of 150 feet for utility. Spotsylvania uses the underlying zoning district setbacks. The visual impact, both localities do require view shed studies, buffers and screening. I believe both do have landscaping ordinances. Essex, the smaller facilities would go through the typical landscaping standards. As they get larger, the buffers do get specified, and Spotsylvania handles it through the conditional use process. In decommissioning, both localities do require decommissioning plans and sureties with various levels of requirements and follow-up with that. So for our recommendations tonight, we do have, as you all know, we have drafted solar standards for medium scale, small scale, and utility scale in Article 7. For use permissions, we didn't have any changes to the medium or small scale. Currently, we have it proposed as utility scale by right and industrial special exception in ag. If you would like more control over the by right nature and industrial, we can change that to special exception across the board. Clearing and grading, right now all scales of facilities are proposed to, number one, limit to only what's necessary, no unnecessary grading on the ENS plans, and then a disturbance of 2,500 square feet or more would trigger a special exception. We don't have proposed changes to that text tonight, but we would want to recommend that as you review special exceptions that you consider incremental clearing conditions so that the whole site doesn't get graded at once. I believe we've been finding with lessons learned from other localities that has become an issue with some of the larger scale facilities doing mass clearing at the same time and then having some erosion events. So the incremental condition can help with that. Lot coverage, we do have the 65% lot coverage max for utility scale. It's not currently addressed for small or medium, so we do have a recommendation if you would like more control over the medium scale facilities. It says 1 megawatt. I believe it's supposed to say 1 acre, but anyway, we can add the 65% standard to medium scale facilities for ground mounted, if that would be something that the board would like. For noise, we will talk more about noise later, so some of this would be pending, but basically we'd want to make sure that any decibel level specified for noise will line up with the proposed noise standards that we'll talk about for industrial uses and districts. For fencing, as proposed, utility scale facilities do require security fencing. From an aesthetic point of view, if you would like more control over that, because I believe chain link and barbed wire could be used, then we would want that buffered and screened from view. We can add that in if that's a desire of the board. For buffers and screening, currently the small and medium facilities require going through Article 8 with the landscaping standards. Utility scale does have some more provisions outlined for a buffer around the perimeter, but when we looked at it, we thought maybe it could be more specific so that medium scale has to comply with buffer type C. That is a more intense and a little bit more vegetated buffer with a greater width. And then also clarifying that utility complies with Article 8 with enhanced width and planting requirements, meaning it would have to abide by buffer type C, which is a 50-foot width, but we would say if your utility, it would actually need to be a 100-foot width buffer, and then otherwise follow type C, but with the outer 50 feet to type C specifications and the inner 50 feet of that buffer with staggered rows of evergreens to help with screening and noise attenuation. We wanted to throw this chart in. This just helps show the buffer discussion a little bit. The red boxes outline the types of buffers that are currently possible depending on the facility and depending on the underlying zoning district. So sometimes type C is triggered, but there are the lesser buffers of type B or even no buffer could be potentially possible. So if you would like to, we can specify that and give it a little bit more weight to that buffer. And with that, that's kind of the quick roundup of our recommendations for solar. This is basically a summary of what we just talked about. Are there, so we can start with use permissions. We can revise the proposed text so that utility scale facilities require a special exception in all allowed districts. Are there any thoughts or discussion on that point?
Does anyone want to start it off? We'll start, well, I guess with use permissions, as she had said. Does anyone have any? Go ahead, Ms. Binder.
I might as well start it off. My, and this is in all of them, is my concern with allowing the by right is that once the planning commission or board of supervisors, if it's by right, you only get one bite of the apple. And to see how it's cited on the property and to make sure you don't just get a cute little napkin drawing and just say, trust me. So that's my concern. And there's got to be a way we could all work together to figure out what that standard is. But by right just is blanket rezoning. And when I was in the state committee on solar, we talked about that localities get a little uncomfortable when somebody says trust you. So I'm just going to throw that out. I'm concerned by the by right.
So I'm sorry, Ms. Binder, are you saying you don't even want to see it by right in industrial is what you're saying?
Well, it depends on whether it's brownfield or greenfield. That's the one thing. Willing to hear the discussion on that because there's a difference between a brownfield site that's an industrial site that's already not used for agriculture. It's already an industrial site. That by right, absolutely. Okay. Because it's already a brownfield site. I'm talking about agriculture and greenfield sites because you have more control to be able to look at the plan, the application and see if, to make sure we have checks and balances. If it's by right, as long as they follow the standard, we'll never see it. We'll never see it on the planning commission or the board of supervisor level.
Tracking, yes. For some that's currently zoned.
Correct. And I'm talking about like brownfield or greenfield sites, if
okay.
you know what those are.
I am familiar, yes.
Okay.
So.
My concern is just we don't have a lot of experience with any, solar facilities, power generating facilities, data centers. We don't have a lot of experience. So I appreciate all the work that's been done to generate some stuff for us, but if we make by right now, it's going to be harder than heck to back up and ask them for, to do it by exception. So I'm in favor of doing all of them by exception and establishing some criteria that we're going to look at things from some conditions. And it gives us the opportunity, as we mature with experience with these things, then we can come back and change the ordinances so that some areas, some conditions can be by right. And I'd feel a lot more comfortable if we sort of slow roll this.
Mr. Collins?
I agree with you, sir, and Ms. Bender on special exemption, except for the category would be rooftop. So I think that should be by right, but the rest of it should be special exemption. Thank you.
So would you be referring to the small scale?
So I don't know what a rooftop megawatts or watts.
Small scale with including rooftop facilities would continue to be by right. This is really only talking about the utility scale.
Only talking about what? Okay. So the answer would be yes.
Is small scale inclusive? You say you have someone that wants to put one in their yard and not on their roof. Would that be small scale also?
I think it would come down to the final specs of it, but it could qualify as small scale.
So we may want to put rooftop is by right. There's no problem with that, right?
Okay,
So for clarity, the small scale is usually, as it says, it's a lot smaller. It could be on the roof, it could be on the ground. There are use standards along with it if it is on the ground, that it does have to be landscaped and buffered and that sort of thing as well.
Mr. Collins?
Mr. Myers, I was going down that same route too. The rooftop's fine. The ones, even a residential where there might be issues with, I don't really want a solar panel reflecting upon my house by right also. Thank you.
I'm going to agree with Mr. Kendrick's point too about special exception. I think we've said this a lot of times in the Planning Commission. It's a lot easier to let the cat out of the bag slowly than try to get it back in. So I think we try to grow with these proposals as they come along, learn from them, and then adjust accordingly.
So I'm hearing seems to be consensus for solar to, based on the recommendation to move utility scale to special exception in the industrial district. Does anyone oppose that or want to speak up? Okay.
Okay.
All right, we'll move on.
So just confirming, we will change the utility scale by right option in industrial to a special exception. Thank you for that. Moving on, lot.
I apologize. So we also had medium scale, and I heard a couple of people say that they didn't want to see by right for anything except small scale rooftop. And so medium scale currently has it for industrial and industrial light as by right.
Yes, it is by right for certain types of, in those districts. If there's desire, we can change that to special exception.
I was just bringing it up because I heard what I felt like was a desire to move away from that. But
I think you're correct. It was a desire to move away from that.
So framing that, 1 megawatt, if I heard you correctly, is 6 to 8 acres. Is that correct? Is typically what it takes to generate a megawatt from solar?
Roughly, yeah.
Okay.
Now that's lot coverage. I'm sorry.
I think Mr. Parker was just trying to understand the acreage to megawatt requirement.
6 to 8 acres is the rough standard for size.
I'm just throwing that out there for for reference. If anybody wants a benchmark about what a medium scale would be.
So what? I'm sorry. What was the consensus? Was there a desire to move it to by special exception for medium as well?
I would agree with that, because it still has the same impacts.
Okay. Apologies. Thank you, though.
Okay, so we will change utility and medium scale to special exception. For lot coverage, we suggest revising the medium scale facilities of over 1 megawatt to not exceed 65% of lot acreage, including the space between panels. This brings it in line or closer in line with the utility scale standard and does set that lot coverage maximum so that the entire lot wouldn't be able to be completely covered in the facility. Is there any discussion or thoughts on this provision?
Does 65% include buffers or the required distance between the required non-panel area? Does that include the buffers, required buffers?
I believe so, yes.
So, okay, so the buffers would be included in that area. So you could have a concentration of panels as long as it was buffered to meet that 65% ratio. Is that what I'm hearing?
It'd have to meet both the buffer requirement as well as the 65% requirement based off, I believe, the way that the Berkeley group is presenting it. But as well as there would be a certain amount of buffer, obviously, that you would not be able to develop, and that would be included in the calculation of figuring out what that 35% total undeveloped would be. Is that a correct assessment?
I believe so.
Okay. So someone could develop 65% of the property at max. Yep.
I just have a clarifying question.
Go ahead.
So you need 6 to 10 acres to get 1 megawatt, and only using 65% of the total acreage. So it would have to be a larger site, right, to get that megawatt.
Presumably, yes.
Okay.
By nature, it would end up affecting the larger facilities more. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
But I would like to point out that some planned communities generate their own solar with integrated solar plans in their subdivision development. Also, some utilities may. And I'd like to inquire what did we do for steam plants? Did we, that produce, steam or energy for utilities? Did we have a restriction or a by right to build a furnace and boiler and make steam, or to even generate electricity on site mechanically?
I'm sorry, can you rephrase that question again?
What is our current ordinance regarding on-site power generation?
For residential?
No, for a industrial, say a cement manufacturer may want to, or a ceramic potter. But I have 2 points. One is the size of the facility for a planned community or a planned industrial site may include a megawatt or more of generated power. Do you want to restrict those from industrial areas? Because they're going to fly by. For large scale.
Yes, that would, so if the facility itself, if the power generation is pertinent to the primary use, and I don't know if Rebecca needs to chime in just with she has a little bit more history with the rest of the ordinance. But if it's not there, we can take a look at that, if that's a desire of the board and the planning commission. I would have to, I do apologize, I would have to review that and double check.
Thank you. I have one more question. This is for everybody. When this first came up, so there's an opportunity for us to get revenue. Why do we manufacture a lot of stuff here that gets taxed in our gross? We pay business taxes. Is there an opportunity to capture any revenue from these large-scale PPAs or independent power producers?
Didn't we pull that thread once and it wasn't revenue generation from solar? I seem to remember that was a fruitless endeavor.
So yeah, in our past experience, the revenue generating facilities are actually the very, very large facilities. Unless there's a siting agreement or something like that that the applicant does with the county. Otherwise, related to your other industrial uses, I'd have to rely on Heather for your existing ordinance to remember what those were. I would assume a lot of those were required special exceptions, unless in the heavy industrial district. And in terms of like community solar and those types of things, that would most likely fall under your medium scale, which previously we discussed and landed that it would be special exception in like the A1, A2 district and some commercial districts as well. So that's just from past discussions with everyone.
Right, well, perhaps I wasn't clear. I was referring to large and utility scale. I mean, say like a Birchwood. We did not tax power generated Birchwood. We got equipment and property tax revenue, but not any, production manufacturing type revenue. Now, I don't know if that was part of when we first cited it there. There's nothing I can find in Virginia statute that says we cannot put an excise tax on power generation for large or medium.
So I'm going to ask Ms. Hall if you could, and as the Dillon rules state, my understanding would be if the code is silent, that means we can't do it. But is that an accurate assessment?
We'd probably have to confirm that conclusion, but I think the legislative changes with the siting agreement were intended to kind of give that carrot to the local jurisdictions to have willingness to attract. So I would venture to speculate a little bit that was kind of a fix to try and get some local buy-in for this type of project.
Thank you, Ms. Lackey.
So in terms of the lot coverage, I feel like we've, kind of stepped away from that portion of the conversation a little bit. So where do we stand in terms of the lot coverage for medium scale?
I think there's consensus that the recommendation is what we would like to see put in place. But please speak up if you disagree with me.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I think it's a little low. If I own property and I'm looking to get a little something out of it, I think 65% seems low, but I have no frame of reference.
Okay.
Other than percentage. Just my 2 cents. I don't know what would be more appropriate. Like we were talking about earlier. I mean, 65%. So if you're looking to generate a megawatt, 68 acres. I mean, you're talking about a pretty big piece of land. So if I own that much land, then I'm really only going to be able to work with 65% of it.
Yep.
Is it meaningful for me?
Understood.
And that's what's in my head.
Okay. So roughly around, you're looking at like around 12 acres in order to then
40%.
On the high end in order to produce a megawatt would be roughly, and that's assuming you could use all 65%.
Right, and I don't know if that's a reasonable thing. Is 65% reasonable? Like I said, I don't know. I don't have a frame of reference. I think it was brought up by a Berkeley group because we were looking at other counties, and that was just kind of a starting point. And I don't know that we actually had that discussion. I think we worked out all of the other parameters, but yeah, I don't think that we commented or talked about the 65%.
So are you saying for just the medium scale, or are you speaking to even the utility scale?
Even utility scale.
Even the utility scale. Okay.
I believe that 6 to 8 acres has space in it. I've never seen a solar farm that doesn't have a way to cut between the rows, so there's gonna be space. I believe that 6 to 8 acres already has some space built in it.
That's probably a fair point, but it's probably not 35% of the property. So I don't know how to properly quantify that. That's a fair question. So, and we did also move all of those to special exception only. And so then does give you some more influence over that process. So if you increase the percentage, you still have an opportunity to look at it from that perspective as well. So I can see what Mr. Moss is saying.
So maybe we don't have it as, sorry.
I think when we, can I? I think when we started solar a few years ago, our main concern, or at least my main concern, was how the land is used. Are the panels going to be following natural contours, preserving drainage ways on the land, basically preserving the land so that it can be returned to agricultural use after the life of the project is finished. I don't know if I don't remember percentages or if those conversations led to this ratio or not, but that's my main concern, is that the land be preserved, not so much the final number that we end up with. So I'm also thinking about Mr. Stonehill's article that he passed out around basically incentivizing, and we need to find some sort of policy to incentivize innovative approaches to these things. So I'm hate to make it a lot more complicated than just a 65-35 ratio, but I think we need to look at it that way. And I think we can under special exception, but I hate to put a hard number on it like that without opening the door for those innovative approaches.
Ms. Binder?
Yes, and I was going to bring this up during buffer, but now it pertains to this, and I learned all about this when I was on the state committee. Is there's basically, if you take a forested piece of land and then you put solar panels on and clear it for that, it becomes a meadow. So Mr. Stonehill's are correct. You create things on it, it's now a meadow. So you want to create, things that attract bees and other, to try to keep the soils down. But it now becomes a different topography. It becomes a different thing once you forest it. And also with that, with the buffers part, and I'm only bringing this up now because it all kind of correlates, is there's a difference between an old growth forest and a new growth forest. And when you buffer or lot coverage, you tear it down, you put a tree down, it's 2 foot, not an 80-year-old tree. There's a lot different. So that's all stuff that we need to consider in the lot coverage and in the buffer, is to make sure we clarify those. Because if you just put a vegetative buffer, that could be a 2-foot tree that would take 80 years to grow. Soil erosion, the whole 9 yards.
Mr. Myers, I felt like you had something you want to say.
I had a question on, was the 65% our number, or was that Berkeley Group's number? Is that a standard number kind of, or is that something that we already had in our ordinance?
Yeah, we have seen that in other localities. I don't believe it's in the ordinance currently.
So it's more of a standard number that's used in other counties.
Yes.
Yeah, we've used that in a lot of communities, with more in mind the utility scale solar, but that number can be adjusted. And something that someone mentioned a moment ago was that you've changed these to special exception. And so if everyone is uncomfortable at 65 and thinks that should be a little higher, to allow more lot coverage, then we can adjust that to 70 to 75. And then when the applicant comes in, and you review what the site looks like, and they can make the case, you can allow even more than that. You can say, no, these are my concerns, and restrict that. So you have those options in the future.
Mr. Collins?
So I definitely do not want it raised. I would rather go the other direction. You got to remember what the purpose we're here for. Planning Commission, Board of Supervisors is not to protect the solar industry or even what their revenue is. Our main concern, and always should be, is our community and what the citizens want the community to look like. So I hear talk about allowing more space and this and this and this, but now you think about if you're going to be living next to one of these places. Um, that's not what the feel of the community is, what I'm saying. The feel of the community is rural, and we do need our industrial and our big business, but we need them done correctly. So 65%, I actually think is a too low a number. Too high a number, excuse me. I would be more in the range of 50%. So if you look at roads, you look at streams, you look at buffers, you look at all the other ancillary things, 50% is not an unreasonable number. Go down to Essex, you'll see what I mean when you drive through there. I don't even think they're at 50% of that land. So
if I may, really what I think is that we don't have a hard and fast number. I think we would speak to some kind of intended ratio, and then allow the plan to come forward and have the applicant speak to it. That's kind of my point, is to not have a hard and fast number in there.
So the hard and fast number, I think, should be below 65.
Ms. Kupka.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So you mentioned that you came up with this 65% number, and thank you, Mr. Myers, for asking that question, because that was the question I was going to ask. How did you come up with this 65% number? And so the statement was made that it was in looking at other county solar ordinances, but your comparison here, my understanding is Fauquier is 80%. Is that correct? Stafford is 80%. The other localities don't have a percentage for the most part.
The utility scale in the proposed King George ordinance was at 65%. That's what we carried over to the medium scale recommendation tonight. In terms of the benchmark localities that we did look at, which were Essex and Spotsylvania, Essex, this is consistent with Essex, I believe, and Spotsylvania, I don't believe, addressed it.
Okay, so.
But again, as Rebecca said, if 65%, that's what we started with, we can adjust that for this locality's needs.
So I would be interested in seeing, since it seems like the pulse is to make it by special exception, then I would be more inclined to have a higher percentage based on project by project basis, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Mr. Fox.
Yeah, picking up on that, I think if it's to be by special exception, we should state certain criteria that we want to evaluate and comment on when we make that review, but it would be, site determinative at the time, depending upon what was brought by the developer. So in other words, rather than fixing hard and fast numbers, we state the criteria we want to look at: buffering, site, view shed, et cetera, all the things we must tick, all the boxes we have to tick, but not necessarily back into hard and fast numbers, because it's going to be by special exception in any case, right? If that's what's to be done.
Mr. Collins.
And
So special exemption, excuse me. So special exemption, people come for the special exemption. The Planning Commission, Board of Supervisors, we get beat up a little bit. We usually come up with something in the middle. So if you started out at 65, people that want 80, they don't even need to come here. So why not start out what is real? We're trying to make these ordinances to where it can be easier for people to do their projects, so they already know what to expect, and not come in and try to beat up for another 5% or 10%.
I think he's saying, though, that it could go above. I know that's your hard and fast number, but I don't know if that's the consensus of everyone here. Is more what Mr. Fox is saying.
Well, that's what I was trying to convince him.
That's fair.
So,
Mr. Kinder, go ahead.
Well, as my dad would say, you can always go to a range, X and Y.
So I guess my concern is not so much the 65% number, but what I've heard other people comment on. Don't want to see a whole bunch of change to the natural topography. I don't want to see old growth, timbered land cleared just for the sake of putting up, solar collectors. natural drainage left in place so that we don't create problems, those kind of things. I'm comfortable at 65 because that means they're not going to come into a large site and just wipe it clean. But I'd be willing to go higher if it was already cleared. They weren't having to change the topography, those kind of things. So I guess I'm agreeing with Mr. Fox is that I'm not hung up on the percentage as much as I am with establish some buffers, establish things to save the topography, existing old growth trees, those kind of things. And then I'd be willing to negotiate with a developer.
Understood. Mrs. Bender.
And so,
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
yeah, if I may, real quick, I think what I'm hearing, there's difference of opinion, obviously, and there's no real set number, and I don't know that we will come to a set number tonight. And so, actually, as I'm hearing and thinking here, my suggestion would be that we remove the percentage number, and instead, we've already got, talking about requirements for buffers and for other things like that. And then in terms of the application, we can put a requirement that the applicant address those things, the buffers and all of that stuff, and explain their percent coverage. So then that opens up the conversation for you all with the applicant to talk about their percent coverage and the topography and their landscaping and their ENS and all of that stuff. Is that something that sounds reasonable?
I will say yes. I would like to see that. If we have a special exception, it does give us a lot more leverage in order to look at it on a case by case basis. And even if there never turns out to be one that's over 65%, that's fine. But if there is one, then it has an opportunity to come forth, and it doesn't get shot down necessarily just because it didn't meet that requirement. Ms. Binder.
Thank you. I was going to jump onto that one because when I heard from solar developers on that community, and there was a lot, one of the big things they said is they want consistency, and they're willing to play ball with communities if there's consistency, like criteria and a checklist, so that everybody's treated the same. So by doing what is suggested, that would be treating everybody the same. It would be criteria and a checklist, and it doesn't look like we're stymieing development, but we're working with it to try to have for each community and each lot what's the best.
So when amenable, or as a majority amenable to moving forward with the suggested proposal?
I'm good with it. I mean, just from if you look at King George in general, any given lot's going to have a ton of RPA in it, so that's going to neck it down, right? So I think we just look at it as a case by case basis.
One late thought, I saw Essex has a 1 mile from the Rappahannock restriction. Is that something we should consider?
That was something that we discussed early on with the Planning Commission, and it was decided that because of your location and rivers and the shape of your county, that would restrict too much of the community. And so we decreased that down, but we still, I believe, have a limit in there. And I can pull that up if you give me just a moment. Yeah, I'm not seeing it right offhand. There is a requirement for environmental impact assessment that would include considering wetlands, rivers, streams, floodplains.
My thinking was principally about a viewscape for the boating and recreational community in the summer.
There would still be landscaping and buffer requirements, so that should screen for that purpose.
Great, thank you.
Okay, I think we have a majority.
Okay, so yes, just to confirm back, to make sure I'm on the same page, we're going to remove that percentage number for medium scale NADA requirement, that to the application submittal requirements to address things in their narrative like buffers, their lot coverage percentage, and that relationship to topography and ENS. So is that something that would apply to medium and utility scale, or just?
I would think since they're both by special exception currently, yes.
All right, moving on to buffers, definitely a related topic. Again, just as a reminder, medium scale has a variety of buffers that might apply depending on the site, the underlying district, and the size. Utility scale facilities do have some buffer provisions in the currently proposed text, but we can beef that up a little bit. So our initial recommendation is that medium scale facilities that they do comply with the landscaping ordinance in Article 8, and further all ground mounted facilities greater than 1 acre will comply with buffer type C, that is the most intense buffer in the tables in Article 8. Similar provision for utility scale to specify type C, remove any of the loopholes to do type B or less. But further, we would take type C, which is a 50-foot width, and expand that to 100 feet wide for utility scale, and then with the enhanced planting provisions for that extra 50 feet. And evergreens were specified there. They do grow a little bit faster. They can get a little taller and provide that screening, hopefully a little bit quicker, because we do know, yes, when the buffers are planted, there is a bit of time before the full effect of them are felt.
Does anyone have any strong feelings on recommendation? Ms. Bender?
I just want to say, when it's a property that's not forested, already old growth, that maybe keeping as part of that old growth in the front as a buffer, as opposed to clear cutting the land and then planting new growth that's smaller. And then I know in other localities, one of the things that they had mentioned is making sure it's not like right up to the road, to make sure that there is a distance back and then the growth in between, so it doesn't reflect on cars, especially if it's a highway setting. Because some of the older localities that had them didn't do that, and now they regret not having that.
And again, those could all be addressed as well during special exception, since obviously it won't go through until
And
it's seen.
Those items are in there currently. It does talk about maintaining, trees where it can happen, and we do have the buffer width of 100 feet, so that does help set it back away from roads.
I just do have one more clarifier on one of the issues in Sussex County, especially, is when sometimes when they purchase the large scale property for it, they clear cut it before they put in the application, and then they can't, all the old growth is gone, and then they put in a new buffer. Is there any way to stop that from happening, or is it because they can clear it before there's an application in?
Unfortunately, they can clear it before there's an application in, and I've pondered that often, but have not come up with a good solution for that one, unfortunately.
I didn't think so, but I figured I'd ask. Thank you.
Okay. So I think
So what I was hearing there is the proposed language for revisions hits that mark with making sure that any old growth vegetation is retained. So if that's not already in the other proposed language elsewhere, we can double check that, make sure it meets that, and If it doesn't, we'll make sure it gets in the special exception criteria.
Thank you.
All right, and then noise, and we will have, again, a broader discussion on that later. Right now, I think we just want to make sure that anything coming out of that gets reflected consistently in the other ordinances. Right now, that would be a utility scale, has a 65 decibel limit at the property line. And then I believe there's also a 50 or 55 decibel level to the nearest residential dwelling. When we get into our noise, we have a slightly lower standard when adjacent to residential, or actually within a distance of residential of 60 decibels. So assuming that goes through, we would lower this to be consistent or otherwise reference that noise ordinance or the performance standards.
Makes sense.
For fencing, or I'm sorry, did you have something?
Yeah,
on
it's a
noise?
consistent level, right? It's not peak. So they start up a generator, peaks up to 84 dB, comes back
It would be
down 30
for-
seconds later.
It would be for the continuous noise, yes.
What would generate continuous noise on a solar farm?
There's
believe the-
not a lot in the day-to-day operations of a solar farm. There's not a lot of noise. But one thing I will clarify is that I'm reading the standard, and it says shall not produce a noise level that exceeds 65 decibels at the property line, or 50 measured at the nearest neighboring dwelling. And so that could be a momentary startup of a generator or something like that, could be captured by the way that this is written.
I think Mr. Stonehill had a question, so I'm going to let him go and then.
Before we get too far along, again, on the setbacks and locations and stuff, where'd you come up with the 1 mile, has to be within 1 mile of the transmission line?
And from the existing proposed language, I would like to defer that to Rebecca only because
Yeah,
I
I'll
wasn't
take that,
here.
Tori. So that's in the initial drafting of this, and that is something that we have used in a lot of localities, and it comes from sort of a tolerance level and thinking about sites that have to install large utility lines through communities, neighborhoods, and creating a lot more impact than just the original solar site. So trying to keep that a little more condensed, a little less impact to the whole community. That's where that measure comes in.
Well, isn't that, I mean, looking at some of the other local, the ordinances around us, they have a much more distance, up, I think I remember seeing like 2 miles and things. That's gonna cut back a lot of properties that are possible that wanted to do that.
And that's completely up to your county. If you want to be, more open to solar, then sure, increase that number. If you're okay with, that type of transmission line going in and connecting, if that's something that you all tolerate, then increase that number. If it's not, then, communities sometimes want even, stricter than that. It's completely up to you all.
Okay, thank you.
My concern on that would be if we get into that point, it's going to require running those cables, and I wouldn't want to get into any sort of eminent domain issues with that if that was the case. I mean, I think just the mere routing something more than a mile is going to be disincentivizing for an applicant to have to like buy that right away to be able to do that.
There are some major lines that just came in, Dominion and all that, they put all those new big power lines
Right.
in, and, they're already there, ready to, be connected, I guess. I was just wondering where that mile came from. I mean, we have a lot of rural land here that's a little bit more than that, maybe away. So I'm just wondering about, if there was a way to connect further, but to go ahead, but to stay within the, not being seen, the buffers and all that stuff for the power line. So.
If it's special exception for large-scale utility in A1, A2, because I don't think this would apply in industrial in our county, we would have the opportunity to consider greater distances on a case-by-case basis. It's a large-scale utility in A1, A2, because I think that's mostly where we apply to, not industrial. If we make it by exception, I think we could consider an exception to that.
So we made a change to make it by special exception in all districts for the large scale, or the utility scale. So
Isn't it in A1, A2 now? Or?
it is by special exception. But I was just saying we made changes so it's by special exception in all districts, including industrial. So I just
give both bodies the most flexibility in making. I mean, if we want to support solar energy in the right places and discourage it in the wrong places, and that's really a.
So you're saying that similar to lot coverage, that would be one of those points that would be addressed during
Precisely.
the application process of the special exception.
Precisely.
Okay.
I mean, I certainly agree with that. If a developer came in and the only way he could reach a major power line was running 1.5 miles through a residential area, I wouldn't like that. If he's running 1.5 miles through basically an agricultural area, wouldn't bother me as much. So.
And the special exception would give you that more leverage. So, okay. Then is there a consensus then to, I guess, remove that language for the 1 mile distance?
I'd be in favor of removing that 1 mile limitation.
Okay. Seems to be that there's consensus on that. So apologies for going back, but we can circle back to noise now.
No, that's good.
So I'll go back to noise. So can we change that language so instead of an event, that it would be stated as continuous? Because right now, if a leaf falls out of a tree and it's more than 60 dB, that's a problem.
So you do want it to only impact the continuous average sound.
That's my thought,
Okay.
but again, it's discussion.
So at the end of the day, it would come down to, from an enforcement perspective, someone would have to come out. So if you have a one-time event and then someone hears a noise and they call, then as someone comes out, it's not going to be going on. And I'm not saying don't codify that it should be by continuous. I'm just trying to, I guess, capture the idea that means someone has to be there measuring it when it does occur.
That's it. There are provisions that we can add for impulsive sound if that's something.
No, don't change this for me. I mean, I'm looking for a discussion and consensus.
But just so you know, so if we add in provisions for impulsive sound, either here or in the broader noise discussion, that could potentially capture those semi-frequent or infrequent or one-time noises. As proposed right now, though, we're just talking about the continuous ongoing sound, the average sound that's coming out of industrial uses.
That's
just
what you're
as
referring
like
to.
a preview.
Okay.
I would think a solar farm should be much quieter.
Solar farms generally, I think maybe if there are power supplies appurtenant, there could be other things that are part of the facility that could generate noise. But in general, that decibel level tends to be consistent with what would be acceptable for residential. And it could be that, yeah, maybe no solar farms in King George get to that point, which would be great. But I think if there is something that we're not thinking about or the technology evolves, we do have that standard there.
Yeah, the only thing I can think of is humming of transformers when you're doing
That's likely, yeah.
things up and down and get out of it.
One of the things to look at too is some of the newer solar panels now rotate so that they follow the sun. So is there any noise that comes from the mechanics that help the panels rotate?
Again, through number one, through the noise standards that will be discussed with the provisions for sound studies, that would hopefully be the type of thing that is captured in the sound study to clarify that whatever is generating noise, we want the noise experts to confirm that it's meeting the specified levels. So yeah, as in particular, as technology evolves or different facilities may have different types of equipment or mechanics, so the sound study would hopefully capture that. So
I'm in favor of leaving it the way it is. I don't, because then you get, if there's a high and a low and how, I mean, if it's happening every minute, is that too much, or is it happening? So if you just leave the standard, you know, you're there.
So I think I'm hearing to, other than changing it for consistency with any other noise standards that come out of this discussion, otherwise leaving it as is, and just revising for consistency. Okay. So that ends the solar discussion. We'll move on to data centers.
There was one more item there about fencing. Did I?
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I
miss?
Oh,
I'm
yes,
assuming
sorry.
that people
Fencing. Yes.
want
So
this, that the fencing would be behind the buffer. That's very typical. It just was missed in the original drafting.
My only quick question is how high is the fencing? Do you have anything in there about the height of the fencing?
let me double check.
We do. I just need to get to it.
I'm only asking because something like that would definitely be an attractive nuisance.
I don't see a max height, but it says a minimum of 6.
Minimum 6?
Yeah, minimum of 6 feet is, and that's because industry usually needs it, you know, high enough to keep people from jumping over and that sort of thing. Also, 6 feet actually helps so that wildlife stays out and doesn't, you know, jump and get hurt and that sort of thing too.
And is that something we can discuss? Like, just say there was a place cited near some place where kids were, that we could make it a little higher. If you know, since it's by special exception, that fencing could be changed the height if we have to.
Yes, you can do that through the special exception.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so other than the special exception question, is there consensus on the added provision to place the fencing so that it's fully screened behind the buffer? Yes, thank you. Okay, now we will move on to data centers. So just a really brief overview, data centers consist of network computer systems for data storage and processing, along with supporting equipment such as batteries, backup generators, and cooling devices. Hyperscale is the largest scale data center, typically exceeding 5,000 servers or 10,000 square feet. Enterprise and edge facilities are smaller but operate in a similar way. And then the size there can vary greatly. Cryptocurrency mining is a type of a data center that may require more intensive electricity and water usage based on the high amounts of processing power that that activity requires. Some land use considerations for data centers are the building appearance. These can be large, sort of monolithic buildings. They can technically be 1 story, but still be upwards of 60 to 70 feet in some cases. So some standards for aesthetics, things like that are typically recommended. Screening and sound attenuation. Data centers can be very noisy, and although the noise inside can typically be blocked through the soundproofing within the structure itself, it's the outside, exterior mechanical equipment that can produce the hum that we're hearing many localities sort of reacting to for those that have had a few data centers going in. Energy and water usage, they do tend to be very high users of energy, and if they're using water cooling systems, can be very high users of water as well. Buffers and landscaping, because of the sort of utile nature of these buildings, buffers and landscaping can help with the aesthetics and the character and help with the screening, and to some degree, hopefully help with sound attenuation. Lighting and fencing, because these facilities do tend to prefer security measures, they do often want very bright lighting or security fencing that could include chain link or barbed wire if allowed. So getting those standards to meet community character needs, specifying lighting ordinances, if not already, is typically recommended in different localities. And then the traffic impacts, they actually typically don't have high volumes of traffic. But we throw that in there because you should always be considering that through the special exception process, just to make sure that there's, not something that we're not thinking of or as the technology evolves. The communities that were chosen to look at were Loudoun County, Prince William County, and Mecklenburg County. In the presentation tonight, we'll only discuss Loudoun and Prince William. Mecklenburg is included in your materials, but we found that they didn't have specific data center standards. They really just defaulted to their industrial district, so there wasn't anything that we could really pull from that. And then Loudoun County, I will also note, they're going through a zoning ordinance update. Your memo includes both the current provisions in the adopted ordinance plus some of the proposed language that we were able to find. So just keep in mind that could be ongoing, it could be evolving. They are discussing it now. So if there are changes, that could be forthcoming, but we wanted to go with their proposed language here in this presentation just because we think it sort of captures where they're trying to move to and what their locality has been discussing. So for use permissions, from what we could tell, they would have it by right in certain town center, office park, industrial park, and general industrial districts with a special exception in commercial light industrial. Prince William actually created an overlay. It covers certain commercial, office, industrial, and mixed use districts. Within those overlay areas, data centers would be by right, meeting their performance standards. Outside of the overlay within the same districts, it would be a special exception. And they did prohibit them outright in agricultural, residential, and certain business districts, the more sort of lower intensity districts where they may not be appropriate. For building appearance, both localities actually had fairly similar standards for establishing principal facades, having some standards for aesthetic qualities, making sure materials and design are consistent and a little bit enhanced, particularly the sides that would face, outer that towards roads or, other neighborhoods. And then Prince William did go a step further. They do have some historic sites that they were looking to protect. So they further described that if it's within a certain distance of historic sites or visible from historic sites, they specified dark green or brown or earth tone colors. Heights, fairly similar between the two. The base heights in Loudoun tend to range from about 45 to 60 feet, up to 100 feet is possible. And then Prince William County, 45 to 100 feet, depending on the underlying district. Screening was fairly similar between the two. They want mechanical equipment screened. This helps not only the visuals, but hopefully also that sound attenuation. There are some engineered designs that can be utilized that can do address both the visual and the noise component. Loudon does have some additional setbacks for mechanical equipment, making sure that the noise generators specifically are separated from residential development if that's applicable. They don't have screening requirements if it's adjacent to industrially zoned property. We didn't see that provision within Prince William necessarily, but they do have that all the screening needs to be solid through vegetation, fencing, or walls. For noise, for Loudon, at this time, we didn't notice it being addressed in their proposed language. We're not sure if that's going to be evolving. Prince William does have a noise ordinance that specifies various levels of decibels, particularly against residential would be the most restrictive. And then mixed use generally gets tied in there as well, since it could have some residential land bays. And the 60 and 55 decibel levels are fairly consistent across noise ordinances as they relate to residential. For buffers, again, somewhat similar between the two. Buffers are required with plantings. There is a 6-foot earthen berm provision. Fencing, Prince William specifies their fencing fairly specifically, and he includes some examples of what's permitted. Their main concern tended to be aesthetics. Fencing wasn't specifically addressed in the data center language for Loudon, but they do have that fencing can fit the criteria for a visually solid screen. The floor area ratio in Loudon depends on the district. They have a base FAR of 0.4 to 0.6, up to 1 or 2 is possible with a special exception. Prince William, within the overlay, they can go up to 1. So currently data centers are addressed in your existing ordinance right now in section 417. We do have language proposed in section 764. So of what we have proposed, currently we would say that data centers are a special exception in C2 and I1 and by right in the industrial district. So if more control is desired there, if you want to make sure there's no by right option for data centers, we can make that special exception across the board. Building appearance, currently we don't address building appearance standards in section 7. So we can add additional provisions, very similar to what's in Loudon and Prince William, to establish the principal facades and aesthetic standards for differentiated surfaces, colors and materials, and making sure that they have some aesthetic qualities to fit community character. Height, currently the base districts are 35 feet with option to increase up to 50 feet. And that's provided that, for every foot over base height, you increase the setback by a foot. We can add that provision for height to data centers, except we would recommend allowing up to 60 feet with the same setback provision for every foot over 35. There needs to be an additional foot of setback. Screening right now, mechanical equipment and infrastructure must be enclosed and it must be screened in compliance with Article 8. We can recommend additional provisions to recommend clarifying the location of the mechanical equipment. Again, referencing the setback, we can make sure that if there's certain sensitive areas, that mechanical equipment is specifically cited with a different setback. And then we can also add provisions about the character and design of that screening. For example, making sure that, if there's a certain fence material that you don't want, that it's, we can specify that. Buffers, this is similar to what we talked about in solar. Right now, we say that they need to comply with Article 8, the landscaping ordinance, with the various buffer options that would be triggered by the tables in Article 8. We can clarify that and specify that the transitional buffers include type C and alternative buffer berms, and it would remove the option for type B, which is that thinner buffer width. And then currently for the floor area ratio, it's not addressed in section 764. But if more control is desired there, we can add a maximum FAR of 0.6. Noise is not currently addressed in the proposed text. We do have some recommendations for additional provisions. And again, some of this would be pending where we land on the noise or noise performance standards and how you want those to apply. But in a vacuum of data centers, we wanted to make sure that we had additional sound studies. We did see where other localities have added those to either conditions or within their ordinances. So that sound study is part of the application submittal to confirm the anticipated noise levels. Annual sound studies to confirm that noise levels are remaining within the permitted range. And then there would actually be an initial sound study as well. That the initial one being post-construction, but before the CO, to make sure then that those anticipated levels, that the actual levels are meeting what the anticipated were specified in the application test. And then again, the 75-foot minimum setback for mechanical equipment when adjacent to residential property for adding some distance for some sound dampening. And then we can add in some maximum permitted noise levels, specify those decibel levels specifically for data centers or generally for industrial districts and uses under which data centers would fall. So we can get that clarified and specified in the way that you would like. So moving into the discussion portion, again, we have some summaries of the recommendations we just offered. We can start again with use permissions, again, taking away the by right option that's currently proposed in industrial. If that doesn't meet your needs, we can make sure that that special exception across the board so that every proposed data center comes before the Planning Commission and board.
All right, so we'll start with use permissions. Who would like to kick it off? Go ahead, Mr. Collins.
So the use permissions, the only one really at question is the industrial. The rest of them are already special exception. So Mr. Parker, Mr. Moss, Mr. Devise, Mr. Myers, Mr. Kendrick, Mr. Fox, and I can't say your name, Mr. Williams. Every meeting I've listened to of the Planning Commission. Did I miss you, DJ? Sorry. Well, you don't really say much. So all the Planning Commission meetings that I've listened to, which is all of them, you all talk about the same thing. You talk about, Mr. Parker, to quote you, the cat out of the bag. Mr. Kendrick, you say, we don't know what we don't know. So I think we should have special exemption in this as in regards to the data centers, and then we can cross the line when we get there of each situation that occurs, as opposed to having no controls, and we end up with another pyramid, something like that. So that you all spoke a lot about that in your meetings, and I would hope that you would chime in on this. Some of my board members don't agree with that. That's why, I'd ask you all to chime in on that.
Gentlemen?
I guess I would say I agree with you. Data centers, they're having issues with the ones that are already built around the country, noise being the major issue. I don't know that we have the key answer to that question. So yes, I would want to make them by special exemption in all areas. Like I said, it's easier to keep the cat in the bag rather than trying to stuff it back in later.
I concur. I agree 100%. We really don't know what we don't know. And look, at the end of the day, Planning Commission is supposed to serve as the conscience of the county, and we've not had anybody in here who's not affiliated with a data center company come speak in favor of it. Bottom line, there's not a single resident that I can recall that hasn't had some sort of financial or business interests in a data center speak in favor of a data center. So from my point of view, from a conscience of the county standpoint, special exception, we can weigh them as they come in on the merit of the proposal.
Well, Mr. Parker, I hear you. I want a data center, but I want to be able to control
Absolutely.
what we get.
Absolutely.
I'm not against data centers at all. I'm absolutely for them. But I think we need to, and some of the ones that have been proposed or have come in this direction, who have been around talking to some of us, all of us, they can meet all these provisions, is what they tell me. They can meet all the all the provisions that are going to be new, they say they can meet. So why not have it a special exemption? Thank you.
Mrs. Bender?
I'm probably one of the loudest voices to say no blanket rezoning, that it should be by special exception. And when you talk to people from Prince William and Loudoun for and against data centers, those that have had it a while, the biggest thing they said is once you let the devil in the door, it never goes back. So you got to make sure your house is in order before you do things. So it's not saying, I mean, people think I'm anti-data center. I'm just wanting to make sure our citizens are protected and we put everything in place to protect our citizens and not be worried about the money coming in, because they're going to come. But we need to have our house in order before we let them in, because I always hear from longtime residents about the landfill and how all these different things. It's not that we're anti, we just want to make sure that things are put in place and learn from the examples that Loudoun and Prince William County have done to make sure that they all treat us equally and not step all over us, and that we all work together so that these businesses come in and help give us the economic growth that we need and the generation and the tax revenue, but that we don't get rolled over in the process, that everything is in order when we let them come back, because they will come back.
I disagree. Right now, we'd have to go through rezoning in order for a data center to find a place to go in here. I want a data center. You said you haven't heard from anyone. I really do. From the perspective of meeting the needs of this community's financial concerns in regards to all the capital expenses that we have coming up. We had to raise taxes last year in order to address the inflation due to the courthouse. And so we've tapped out what the landfill provides. Landfill has 19 years left, roughly. I know it sounds like a long time. It is not a long time, and it will go away. And when it goes away, if there's not an answer to backfill that, that's going to be 16, 17 cents roughly, based off our current rate that we're bringing in. We need to find a way to answer that question, and we need to work on it sooner. I would like to actively try to bring in someone. I would like to see a data center come in order to address that. We have a preschool that's been requested. We have 2 fire stations. I know when the preschool is done, I have almost 100% confidence that the school board's probably going to come back and say we need another elementary school. There was already almost nearly at capacity. There are a number of capital expenses that we are currently paying towards from the landfill, plus ones that are coming down the road, and we need to find a way to answer that question without putting it on the taxpayer, the citizens of this community. And everyone I've talked to says they don't want to see our taxes go up. That means we need to find a way in order to address that concern.
And that's why I said the merits of the proposal. So if we have the merits of the proposal and it's a valid proposal, what would be the harm in doing a special? I guess. So, Mr. Granger, what's your fundamental opposition to special exception?
Got to go through rezone. So you're saying I want to rezone and then I want a special exception. You just keep adding more and more stuff. And that can be detrimental from a perspective of a corporation coming in and saying, I'm not going to go through those steps. I'm going to go somewhere else. This is something I really would like to see come in. Ms. Kupka has asked to speak, so I will go to her and then I'll work my way around it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So while I do understand the concerns that have been mentioned with regard to allowing it in industrial zoning, and I just want to make clear, we're talking about a special exception.
Right.
It's not a special exemption. That's something that's different. It's a special exception permit.
Tracking.
Is what's in the ordinance here. But I appreciate your recommendation to keep it by right in industrial, but special exception in the other uses, because in your memo on page 8 and 9, you have provided language, suggested language that you could drop in our ordinance that would deal with meeting noise standards. You mentioned the first was, I'm sorry, it actually starts on page 7. So even for industrial, by right, initial testing, this section will require initial sound testing and provide penalty for failing to meet the performance standards of this section. So it says uses shall not receive a certificate of occupancy until conformance with the requirements. After completion of construction and prior to issuance of a certificate of occupancy, the applicant shall submit a sound test, and it goes on and on about the professionals, as credentialed professionals as approved by the zoning administrator. So that's our staff, has authority and autonomy over that. So if the project does not, it says for projects, if the sound test finds that noise levels exceed the maximum permissible dBA stated in this division or any additional use performance standards, then there shall be no commencement of the use and no certificate of occupancy shall be issued. That means you can't go to work and run your business until you get the certificate of occupancy from the county. So that's the first safeguard. The second safeguard that I really like is we can add a requirement for annual testing. It says the applicant shall submit annually a sound test prepared by, again, the same credentials approved by the zoning administrator, by our staff. And, you know, the purpose is to confirm that the noise levels are not exceeding the maximum permissible. So if they do, if the sound test finds that the noise levels exceed the maximum permissible, the applicant shall have 48 hours to mitigate the violation, or the certificate of occupancy shall be automatically suspended, and the applicant shall cease the use until such time that the applicant can demonstrate the noise levels are in compliance with this section. So there are safeguards in place, and I know we haven't approved it, but community development staff has brought forward a recommendation for a zoning enforcement officer. Did I say that position correctly? And so I'd ask a question of staff, that position, because we don't want this to just be complaint driven. That was also mentioned in the memo, that you don't want it to just be complaint driven. You want it to be monitored. So would that proposed position, would that be part of that staff member's duties, responsibilities?
Yes, so currently we do things on a complaint basis at the direction of the board. Presumably, should this be an approved position, that might be an amendment to your direction of the future. But yes, that position would be ideally the person who would oversee that.
So for those reasons, and I will say as far as that staff member goes, a lot of times I'm the complainant because citizens contact me to complain about things, and I go ahead and put in a complaint so that it gets addressed. But for all of those reasons, with this language, the proposed language that you've said could be incorporated here, I would be okay with moving forward with the recommendation of by right only in industrial. Thank you.
Mr. Moss.
Right, so I've asked around industry about how it is they process through and identify sites and select sites. And a piece of what came from those conversations is that if they evaluate an area, could be the absolute perfect setup for them. But if there are additional wickets that they have to jump through, then they're gonna look for other sites. They're just gonna move on. So we probably have fantastic area here and really could do a lot to support a data center. But if we make it to where they're just, even if they're small jumps, if there are too many of them, they're just gonna say, okay, we'll look at that later. We'll go in a different pile, and they're gonna move on.
Mr. Fox.
I'd like to suggest that you consider the possibility of holding a public tender for a data center. And when you do something like that, you control the process, you control the criteria, you're not negotiating with yourself constantly, because in order to create the tender, you have to first agree with yourself on what the criteria are. So you're not going to be consistently sort of negotiating with yourself. And this is not as difficult as you might think. First thing you would do is you put out, it costs you virtually nothing. You put out feelers for invite expressions of interests from 2, 3, 4, hopefully credible data center developers. And if you get that level of interest back, then that gives you the confidence basically to hire an advisor who may charge you 150 or 250 grand to help you organize it and run it. But that's peanuts, and it will be paid for by whoever wins the tender at the end of the day anyway. So what that consultant will do is help, drill into exactly what our tender criteria might be, work with us. That could take even 6 months to get the criteria down. In the meantime, the people who've expressed interest get pre-qualified by us. They have to have the right financial capabilities, the right track record capabilities in their industry. They have the opportunity to use that time to go and evaluate their own sites and come back with, get themselves prepared to receive the tender. Yes, it could take a year and a half to play out, but at the very least, at every single step, the county is in control of the process. The county dictates the terms, and you get the benefit of competition, hopefully, from multiple interested parties. I think we ought to consider a public tender for the data center. Thank you.
So originally, I think when the solar came up, or data center came up, sorry, it was, we can make it by right and industrial, and everyone was thinking we have however many acres of industrial. So that's not, if they put it there, that's not a problem. Not thinking, okay, we're going to make a huge site industrial. So that's kind of the first thing. I like Berkeley Group's suggestions. I think going down everything above the noise, I think I could blanket and say I agree with the changes. Once you get past there, I think we need the special exception just to have some kind of say in it. Just not that it's going to be bad, just that we need some kind of say. Right now we have proposals for 700 acres. Looking at most of these data centers that are problems in Prince William and other places, they're 50 acres. They're not 700 acres. And we don't know what that 700, whether that's solar. There's several different uses in there. So I think going forward, if there's projects like that bumping up, asking for a special exception isn't too much. At least it gives us a chance to look at the project before it happens. You mentioned the cat out of the bag. It's just letting us see what's going on. I don't think, everybody knows we need to pay for what's going on in the county. And I absolutely agree. It probably would be good for us, but we would have to be able to see what's going to happen, not just a blanket rezoning and it's all by right and you end up with if we miss something in the code, we have no chance to ask for it or correct it, I think, is going forward. So I think making it a special exception is reasonable, and we can be nice about it when it comes up. We just have to be able to see the project. Just let us see what's going on.
As Mr. Moss said, I don't think we'll see the project then. At that point, you're putting more wickets in place, and it's just not going to get to us then.
Mr. Granger, I 100% disagree with you, because if you follow the grid and the power line, and you know that Loudoun County and Prince William, they're maxed out on the grid and they're worried about the energy needs, there's a Christmas tree that comes down, and we're in the Christmas tree. So they're following the grid line that goes down Route 3. So they're going to come. But, when I've talked to solar developers, the biggest thing they talk about is criteria and standards that are for everyone. and that they can live with a lot of criterion standards if it's uniform for everyone. And I'm not against data centers, but I think it's really a mistake to just blanket rezone and let them, by right, just come in and do what they want because you want the revenue so badly. If you look a lot of these data centers, there's a build out of 5, 10, 15 years. And we have to remember, it's not a data center, it's a data campus. And data centers have multiple buildings, multiple heights. We don't have the fire protection for that. We need to make sure our citizens, in the end, we would like this business. We would like, you've talked to a lot of people, they say if our protection's in place, data centers are a great revenue. They would be probably welcomed in this county, but we need to have the right standards in place, and we need to listen to Prince William and Loudoun County. And they've talked to me, I've talked to them, and they said, please don't do what we did. We didn't know, we were the first people they came to. So please have place in place so that your community to understand that once you let a lot of these data centers in, you go from rural to urbanized overnight because of the infrastructure and the businesses and that. So I disagree, and I will always disagree, and I know I'm going to lose the vote, but I have to make my say. Thank you.
I think as Ms. Kupka said, there are standards in place. So to say there's not, no, that's what the proposal is to put standards in place for for this activity. I mean, that's part of what this proposal has to deal with. That's
Well,
what we're
what-
discussing right here. And so if you don't feel they're stringent enough, that's fine. But there are, I mean, that's what this is. This is the proposal for the requirements of what we need to be done. And I understand what you're saying in regards to blanket rezoning, but I mean, that when the rezoning comes in, you look and you say, is that something I could live with or not? And based off the regulations you have in place.
But once it's by right, we never see it.
You
And that's what
see it before, because there's not a piece of property they really can make this happen on right now.
Could I emphasize again that the middle ground, if you will, is to hold a public tender so that you control the process and you take out the bidders will propose the sites that they want to use subject to our criteria, essentially, right? You get the best of both. On the one hand, bidders get clear criteria because we establish them. They're not guessing as to what they have to do and negotiate, getting into 2-year back and forth. We just lost one because of that process. So let's learn from the mistake and do what municipalities do when they need big, one-off, gigantic, game-changing pieces of infrastructure. Hold a public tender.
Heather, is that, is that, how would that look? Or how could that look?
I honestly don't know how to answer that. That's the first I've heard of this public tender, and I would be happy to look into it. But at the end of the day, the only thing that, as the zoning administrator, that I can enforce is what's in our ordinance.
And I would just ask about your process too. You're talking about, sort of like a multi-level process of having to rezone and then get a special exception. Lots of communities have those at the same time. So the applicant comes in asking for the rezoning at the same time that they're asking for that special exception to be granted if the rezoning is granted. So that's something that can be considered as well.
That's correct, and that's why I propose that to be special exemption. But I don't understand. So our goal is to protect the community and also bring in revenue so that our community can function. So all the planning commission, what I've heard is they're up for the special exemption. All they want to be able to see it. They want to make sure that everything's in place, and then put their stamp on it. And so Mr. Parker said they're the will of the community. So the will of the community is over here saying they want special exemption for it all. And 2 of us say no. 2 of us say yes, I think. So I guess it's really just 1 left.
Ms. Kupka, you had something you want to say?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just wanted to point out that we also could add at the recommendation on page 8, the submittal requirements to Article 3 for a sound study for industrial uses proposed through rezoning first of all, so we can add those standards requirements to any rezoning request. And then I would just ask what my colleague, Ms. Bender, what is meant by fire protection standards?
Well, we do not have, some of these, and we visited some data centers, they could be 75 to 100 feet tall. We do not have, I don't think, training to fight a fire like that. A lot of data centers come with battery storage, they come with generating facilities, some of them come with solar facilities. Do we have trained staff? Do we have equipment for that? I mean, naturally, those kind of companies probably have their own fire protection, but training should be provided. We've never experienced that kind of stuff. And I know you keep bringing up the noise ordinance, but one of the things that we haven't even discussed about noise ordinance of data centers, different company, like a new standard is the quiet ones, visited one. It's very quiet, no complaints. But there are older companies that want to save a little bit on money and they use a lot of water, which has a lot of coolant. And then for generators, you have testing times, different times to check for noise levels. And then also a generator would run a little, for coolant, would run more, or a cooler or a generator, run hotter in the summertime because it's hotter, and so it would be louder. And in the wintertime, if you have a noise standard, maybe the coolant isn't running because it's cooler, so you don't need to cool down the facility. So these are all concerns that I have, in it, and I'd have to relook at the noise standard again because it was a lot of material to absorb in a 2-week time. If that is in there, that it would be different times of the year that there's a noise standard check, because different noise levels are different at different times of the year based on the generation and the coolant of these huge, massive data centers that have a lot of heat.
Ma'am?
Could I finish? She was answering a question that I asked. Thank you. So with regard to the fire protection standards, I would just point out that currently, even as archaic as it is, our battery ordinance, we do require, and I do remember when we passed that, I believe in 2020, asking Chief Moody that the applicant must provide a mitigation plan and be able to address any fire protection issues that come up. And so I would think that that would also fall for a data center project. And as far as not having, say, adequate facilities, those are things we really can't require because we can't request proffers. So we really can't get into that, is all I would say about that. Thank you.
All right, so first, I don't disagree with you that Berkeley has provided a lot of things here that we can address and establish conditions. The only thing I would say that is, in my experience in construction, you put out really firm scopes of work on exactly what you want and all the conditions you want to meet. And when a contractor comes in and they meet the bare minimum, you wind up with a crappy project. And that's where my concern lies there. And that's just based on my experience. I don't appreciate why in combination with a rezoning, we couldn't have a special exemption and exception, and it gives us the opportunity to see a site plan. And that developer comes to us and says, this is what I'm proposing to do. We get to see how big the building is. We get to see how he's proposing siting it, on the property. We get to hear him tell us how he's trying to, remediate the noise issues. We get to see all those things. And if it's bare minimum, we can sort of have that discussion with them that we would like to see additional things done. And it becomes a cooperative kind of a negotiation, and then we're good. I just think that it's a way to wind up with a better project that the county will like. I wholeheartedly agree that I like the idea of a data center coming into the county. It seems like a good, clean kind of an industry. It sounds like a wonderful source of income for the county for God knows how long. But we take one more step and ask for the special exception, and we get to see what he's actually proposing. As soon as we make it by right, he comes in here and demonstrates that he meets the minimum. and then we're stuck. And that's all we get is the minimum. I'm saying that if we have a little give and take, we'll wind up with something more than minimum. My 2 cents worth.
If I may, I feel like I'm hearing some maybe general majority or somewhat consensus on this topic, but could we just go, have raise of hands of who is in favor to change this to a special exception? And then I think we can move on. I just want to make sure we get through our other topics tonight. And Tori, you'll have to help me with what the majority there is, because it's hard for me to see on the screen.
I can't quite see. 1, 2, 3. Seeing 8 hands. And opposed?
By right?
For industrial.
I changed my vote. For industrial.
For the record, 1 vote for public tender.
So I'm sorry. Okay.
So it looked like to me majority was for to change to special exception. Are we ready to? Is that correct? Did I see correctly on the screen?
Yes, it was 7 for special exception, 6 for by right in industrial, and then 1 public tender.
Okay. All right. So let's move on to building appearance. I'll let you take back over, Tori.
Do you feel that way about all industrial activities? Or all commercial? I'm just trying to understand.
Oh, yeah, if we're doing especially a large industrial rezoning, I think it makes it hard to not see what's gonna be there.
So you're saying you want to see every single industrial activity made by special exception only?
No, just when there's a rezoning.
If there's a large rezoning, I mean, so a smaller rezoning, let's say you took Birchwood's property now, and you rezone that to industrial, right next to the industrial park, all makes sense, I'm good. But when you have a large industrial rezoning, it's hard not to see what's gonna be there. I think it just makes that rezoning more difficult.
So is it possible to do a special exception by different size rezoning? Because that's kind of what I'm hearing from you. Is that an accurate analysis of what you said?
I guess there could be a trigger for a certain intensity, a trigger for a special exception versus across the board. You can sort of condition the condition in that sense, where if you can, is it, but then it would be finding that standard that you're comfortable
outside an industrial area, kind of.
Right. I mean,
if you're pinched between the dump and the industrial park now, that makes sense.
So you're saying if you do any rezoning, you want it to then go through a special exception as well?
That's no.
Because right now that would be everything, because there's almost no industrial.
Right. There's very little. I mean, we need to find more.
So I'm just asking though, then are you advocating that all industrial activity should be by special exception only? Because in based on the concerns I heard from you, I mean, that can all apply to
on a
any different project.
On a rezoning, I think anybody, I don't know, I don't want to speak for the whole planning commission, but if you're doing if you're doing a rezoning to industrial, I think everybody's going to know where it is and kind of what you're going to put there. And if it's just straight industrial, anything that's in industrial, okay, we understand that, and then we decide where we want to put that.
I don't think you want to just give them a blank check.
Right.
Essentially.
And I mean, that's the other thing. There's so many unknowns if we don't know what's going in there. Like, for instance, we couldn't even get a VDOT study on that, right? Because we didn't know what was going in. We didn't know what the impact would be because we didn't know what was going there. And to Mr. Kendrick's point, like, what's a site plan? What is it? And so I think there's nobody over here that's anti-data center or anti-growth or anti-anything. We're just exercising an abundance of caution as we move forward to make sure that we don't do something that we can't get ourselves out of. And I think that's what Mr. Myers is saying. It's like when we get these large requests for rezoning and we have no clue what's going to be there, and the public gets that, right? It's just like we just need to know more, and this will allow us to do things in tandem We can run them concurrently, and we can learn more, and at the same time exercise that abundance of caution, make sure that we're exercising the right decisions for the county and the citizens.
Then based on what I'm hearing from you, you would be an advocate for moving everything into by special exception, any kind of anything.
If we're doing large industrial rezoning,
Yeah.
I want to know what's going in. And I don't think that's an unreasonable request.
Okay, because I don't think our proposed ordinance has it in place like right now, that everything would be by special exception.
That's not, I want to know what we're rezoning for. Like, why are we rezoning? Like, to Mr. Meyer's point, if we're rezoning a piece of land that's contiguous to another piece of industrial land, that makes sense, and it's not hundreds and hundreds of acres, okay, that makes sense. We've got hundreds and hundreds of acres that we don't know what's going there, and it impacts people nearby. That's my point. I want to know what's going on. I don't think that's an unreasonable request.
How do you set up the ordinance to allow for that?
That's what we're here for. How do we set up the ordinance to do that?
Well, tonight what we can discuss is the data center aspect
That's
and
what we're doing.
keeping it.
Yes.
So if we're hearing that it's a special exception across the board as a starting standard, also keep in mind these are the types of things that get revisited. Sometimes you need to put it in place. If there is a special exception, that is a good opportunity to see what's coming in, to see what types of facilities are being offered in this community, and then in a few years, it's not uncommon to revisit that, take your lessons learned, and revise those provisions and put that specificity in, relax things here, tighten things there, because I don't know any ordinance that goes in the first time that's going to be perfect. And whatever works in Prince William, Loudoun, or elsewhere also took a lot of massaging to get to, and it might not be a great fit here. So the benefit of putting it in special exception is you do get that look at it. There's nothing that's going to prevent you from assessing how that works against your first applications and then revising it to suit the lessons learned out of that.
So we don't have any more industrial property at this time. It's all gone. So if something comes for rezoning, why couldn't it be an special exemption for the industrial? Because we don't even have industrial. Let's say that somebody gets it done industrial, and then they can fit into whatever category they want. They say, I don't want a data center there now. I want to manufacture bombs there. You know, so they can do that. Well, I don't know if it's in orders, but they can do certain things by right. So why wouldn't we have data centers? But industrial? We don't have any industrial.
So I'm saying have everything. You're advocating to have everything by special exception.
Well, if you look at the reasoning from the planning commission, the answer would be yes.
I don't think that's where we're going.
Well, so what Mr.
It's not.
Mr.
It's
Meyer,
not.
It's not.
What you said is
It's
things that make
a
sense and things that
huge
don't.
ask on I mean, for instance, 700 acres is a huge ask for industrial. That's way more than we have now. And in that, there was battery storage. The property ran all the way along the river. Do we want to put battery storage on that side of Route 3? I'm not in favor of it, but we would never have a shot at that. We would never be able to say, hey, if you just move it over here, we're all good, let's go. But there's also a huge, and you're trying to be fair to all the citizens of the county. There's a huge monetary difference in what industrial land and the other land. So if we're making a 700 acre rezoning, what is it? If it's good for the county, then that makes sense. But not leave it open to 8 different uses or 6 different uses that later on we can try to farm it out. And I'll tell you, I don't know about the rest of the planning commission. I think they do. I know how bad we need it. I know how bad we need it in income. It's not that I don't think we need it in income. It's that we just want a shot at looking at it. Making sure, number one, it's going to be what it said it's going to be, and 2, that it's going to meet all the county's needs. And we're not going to have citizens every time we see them in Food Lion going, you put that thing that's noisy next to my house. And at least we know we had the best chance at saving that. And that's where I am on it. I just want to be able to know that we made the best decision. I don't want to make more loopholes. I'm surprised on that big of a rezoning, they didn't come with drawings and plans of what they wanted and get it out in the open and show us. I mean, we had a golf course that was going to be a gun range that had a packet that thick. We had another place down here that had a packet that thick that they were changing into a camp. And we had guys doing a 700-acre rezoning that give us 3 pieces of paper and say, that's all we're going to show you. Do my rezoning. It doesn't make sense to me.
Mr. Chair, so my only counter to that would be, then do you not have faith in the individuals on the board or on the planning commission? For example, when that came to us, we sent it back because it lacked specificity. So you have to have faith in the people's representatives to make the right decision, which was send it back, because you're not giving us enough information here. So I would just say, yes, you all are the conscience of the community, but so are we. We also express the will of the community.
Having faith in the individuals, that has something, that's apples and oranges. We have a due diligence to do our homework, to do the will of which the planning commission is put in place, and that's what we did.
And I understand that, but that's why we sent it back, because there was no specificity in it.
Mr. DeCorda?
Board team, I appreciate the conversation and hearing from everyone, and I feel like we have heard from each person, and I want to make sure that we get to the other items tonight. So if we can, just let's put a pin on this. This is a topic that we can revisit after we've gone to the public and received public comment on these topics. We can revisit it at adoption time. So there's lots of times to kind of convey your concerns or your response and try to win people over to your side. But let's move on tonight so that we can get through the other.
So I'm going to interrupt you. So I don't like that plan. So we're always pushing something off and hoping something will go away. Well, we need to address this right here, right now. I think we've heard plenty from the community of what they want. And so we need to flush it out here in open. And the Berkeley group, great folks, but just let us talk about it and you just hang tight, is what I think.
And we can do that, but I want to make you aware that we do need to get through these other topics, which might mean that we have to add another work session to this, which would be a change order.
Mr. DeCorda?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I want to commend the Berkeley Group and staff in particular for this work. I feel a lot better about looking at a data center through this lens than I did before the rewrite, and I commend the supervisors for their wisdom in extending this contract to accomplish this work. I also want to speak on a detailed matter. The new ordinance requires the use of public water utilities. The trend in the data center industry is for water cooling, which also creates excess heat, which can be used to heat half. That Birchwood project could have heated about half of the housing stock in the county, and they're quieter. And we got a greenhouse and potential for a greenhouse operation, and the plant and the dump and the methane. But it requires the use of public water, and I don't know if we have the capacity to service with public water a water-cooled data center. And third, I think a lot of the concerns could be addressed through my colleague, Mr. Fox's recommendation for a public tender. It's not that expensive. You get your money back. I've seen it done in communities for projects of this scale, and mixed private-public utilities in the telecoms industry. It's a way to manage growth, and it takes us off the issue. You know, we get to pick the site. We get to pick we take proposals. Exactly. Or we know what a suitable site would be, and we can communicate that in a tender.
In effect, you back them into it by the way you set your
Whether we word it.
Mr. Chair.
Good. Mr. Stonehill.
I had to go look up what public tender was, so. How about we get another perspective from our legal team about that item?
So I am aware of one jurisdiction that's done something along the lines of what Mr. Fox and Mr. DeCorda are proposing. I believe it's Chesterfield County recently had, even though it was a public rezoning of public property, it was highly contentious to rezone parcel of property, a large parcel of property for mixed uses, to include a fire station, to include future data center uses and some other uses. So that's one approach. The difficulty, I think, in that approach is that you have to probably control the land. The county doesn't currently own any land. You could, another alternative, I see Mr. Fox shaking his finger at me. You can also use the public-private partnership statutes. You could put something out. You could have them help you shop for sites. But I think that it could be certainly a meritorious proposal to consider, but I don't think you can totally dodge the issue of special exception or by right in your ordinance. Based on the materials that Berkeley's put together, perhaps another intermediary approach is what Prince William has done, which is to have an overlay for data center. Kind of the next step after you go through this rezoning, the redraft of the zoning and subdivision ordinances, you're looking at updates to your comprehensive plan. So I'm not suggesting, I'm not the policy maker, but that's one option where maybe Berkeley could work on the drafting to have a placeholder for an overlay. So if at any future time you wanted to establish that overlay through the comprehensive plan, that's another alternative, just to give additional options out there. I know we have a lot of options on the table.
Ms. Hall.
So I just wanted to remind everyone that when you are regulating through the ordinance, you're regulating based on your zoning, your use, as well as your lot size. So I hear a lot of pro data center, but maybe not necessarily data campus versus small scale acreage versus 700 acres. So maybe there's some flexibility to narrow down the scope of what we could do by right versus when a threshold of special exception may come in. Is just a suggestion.
So Ms. Hall, that's a good suggestion, because you have 13 votes and we have 14 votes, but there's 13 of them that are for the data center, but how you get there seems to be the contention. So that would probably be helpful to satisfy everyone's needs.
As the outsider at the table, it seemed like the large scale is what really gave most people the heartburn of the unknown and the large scale. So maybe having that sliding scale might be beneficial in King George.
Yeah. So perhaps adding an acreage trigger for a special exception.
I think that would require knowing what the average size of a data center would be.
And they can vary. So at some point, it would also have to come back to the standard that the community feels is too big. They range, honestly, from fairly small, the types of things that used to exist before the modern data centers, where they were kind of parts of office buildings, kind of secondary to primary uses or otherwise small. We do also have the edge and enterprise centers that do tend to be smaller versus the hyperscale. Those are the ones that can get into the tens and thousands of square feet and beyond. So if there is an acreage, a lot size or a building size to try as your initial trigger, we can incorporate that, and then that would give you that by right capability for something smaller. And there's really no formal definition for edge and enterprise, but taking what maybe some of the smaller averages are and then determining if that fits the land uses and the parcel sizes here, would probably be a good flexible way to go through to get the smaller centers in, but give you that chance to review the larger, more intensive and impactful centers. Or campuses, as they could be called.
So in other words, I take my big rock and break it up into small rocks. And now I've got all these small rocks that I can just get around the issue as the data set.
So, I mean, I understand your point, but if we have 13 people that want to go in this direction, but we just can't all quite get there, we can start out with a number, and then we can always revisit it. As Mr. Kendrick says, you know, I've revisited a lot of these things time and time again, so at least we have some movement forward for everybody, with still being reasonable, so that people can see what it's going to be, a certain size.
If we make it special exception across the board tonight, that would give you the opportunity to see how that plays out and come back and revisit that in the ordinance. If you would like the additional research, there may be work order implications. Or if there's a number in mind tonight, we can go with any number.
Mr. Miller, did you have something you want to share?
I guess I wanted to just clarify that if, like the Berkeley Group is proposing, this would be part of the greater overall comprehensive rezoning. It's not something that is necessarily done tonight, or unless there's a motion or there's some kind of a direction to put it on a future agenda to deal with this exclusive issue. Otherwise, it's going into the overall rezoning process, which then still has to go through the approval process. So I just wanted to make that clear. I understood.
You know, I thought that's why we have these 3 items on tonight, is because we were going to do them before the big rezoning, the rest of it. So I thought that's why we were getting together.
You mean like we would adopt them before we would this is part of the crafting the whole rezoning or this whole zoning ordinance. But my understanding was not that we were adopting all this to go into place right away. This was part of the whole to craft it and put it in place so it could be voted on as a whole.
Well, that was part of the discussion, that these things would come first so that we could, you know, everything that's happening in King George, we can at least have.
No, my understanding, this was part of the zoning ordinance overhaul, and this was a work session because there was a desire to go back because we felt like there was more due diligence that needed to be done on this. But this would not be adopted, and it would be adopted as part of the zoning ordinance overhaul. Planning Commission, do you agree that that was your understanding as well? Okay. Ms. Bender?
I just want to make a comment because I know that I do understand that that was what was considered. But my concern is we went ahead and we changed the rezoning of pyramid for hospitals and by right, and we're doing something for micro wineries. But we have a lot of people, there's news reports out there. Data centers and other solar battery are looking at all localities around us, Culpeper, Spotsy, Stafford, not Fredericksburg, they don't have enough land, down the northern neck. My only concern is about getting these in place and then somebody puts in an application, these don't matter, and then we're stuck. But that's just my opinion, my thoughts.
Sense that we're very close to having the overall zoning ordinance for the county redone. We're not that far away. These were sticking points for us on the Planning Commission. If we resolve some issues, then they will move very quickly to finishing that draft rewrite of the entire ordinance. You'll have all this in effect very soon, I think. And we can still get to a data center on the land that has been under discussion in some form or fashion. I don't think we're that far apart. It's our desire on the planning commission to see what they want to develop, rather than just say, okay, go meet these criteria and do whatever you want. I don't think that's a huge difference. We're both trying to get to the point that I hear the two of you want to do, which is go ahead and get a data center and start getting the revenue off of it. I think we're spending a lot of time arguing about do we don't make it an exception. Whatever we put in the zoning ordinance will not only drive this particular developer that you guys have evidently spoken to, but anybody else who follows. And I just don't think you want to lose that kind of control. On this particular development, we can be there in about the same amount of time, no matter which way you go.
Can I ask a question, Mr. Chair, of the Berkeley Group? So in your data center memo on page 1, you reference hyperscale data centers or the largest scale data center typically exceeding 5,000 servers and 10,000 square feet. And then you also mention enterprise and edge data centers are smaller than hyperscale but operate in a similar way. So with regard to staff's suggestion, can you define what those are as far as thresholds to give us a better idea of scale?
It
to
is a
help move
little
this
bit
forward?
difficult to define them. There's a broad, it's not just the size, it also has to do with the type of data being processed, the proximity to the end user. There's a suite of considerations for what is enterprise versus edge. For what I'm hearing here is that it's the end result of the scale. So if there is an identified scale, that would be, if you want to go the trigger route, the hesitation being sometimes if it's technically an enterprise or edge, it could still be large compared to what you were expecting. So if it meets the technological definition, and it does vary in the industry, of what is considered enterprise or edge, we can add those definitions, but I think at the end of the day, what you're trying to, or the concerns are based on the end user scale. So figuring out if it's an acreage size or a building size that becomes that trigger, if it's 10,000 square feet or something that's compatible with other industrial triggers, for things that have square footage triggers, if that's even applicable. But that is something that has applied to various uses in other localities by saying if it's over a certain size, it becomes an SUP or a special exception.
And that would be similar to the way that we just talked about the solar facilities. So we, say small scale, medium scale, utility scale. And so that same, thought could be applied here and naming a scale of these facilities with a trigger point versus using kind of the industry terms. I wouldn't recommend using the industry terms to identify them.
Just got a quick question.
Go ahead.
These terms, because they're different, is there going to be a key at the end? I know I was just thinking about, because you were saying there's different definitions for everything. And if I read some of this stuff, I wouldn't know what it was. Is there going to be a key with this?
Well, as proposed, we would say if it's a data center, it's a data center, it's a data center. So we have the one definition that if it meets, if it's something with servers that processes data, we're going to call it a data center, and it has to meet all of those, requirements. We don't have it proposed for different scales or different definitions, but and we did want to keep it sort of simplified like that so that any data center would fall under that, but that's where we could a little bit more easily apply the size or scale factor.
That's what I was wondering, because there's a difference between a data center and a data campus.
Right, but for the purposes here, the thought was to keep it all under the data center term umbrella. And then if there are size implications that you want to add, we can do that.
I'm just concerned because there is a big difference between a center and a campus.
Okay, we can, so I'm hearing, is there an appetite to add a definition for campus?
It's just me. I'll put up my hand.
I don't mind definitions.
I'm not sure it's that simple, and maybe somebody can educate me. When we talk about a data center, we're talking about a large building with a whole bunch of computer servers linked together. And a data center, in my mind, has always been is that that's all that's in the building, and they sell off that storage to other companies to use. You know, we built labs on base that had, you know, it was a computer lab, but they always had a big room full of all their servers. It was, in essence, a mini data center, you know, but it only served that one building. We're talking about, to me, a campus is multiple buildings, but we haven't talked about how big the buildings are. What's to stop some company coming in and building a humongous single building that was full of nothing but, you know, servers? I mean, as opposed to popping up 16 smaller buildings full of servers. I don't.
I think
sure
that
where we
is
get there.
why we didn't, by keeping it under data center, just being a data center is the trigger for these things. A campus would fall under a center. Now, outside of zoning, there are all kinds of terms and definitions, but in terms of how you're going to view it through the lens of your ordinance, by simplifying it to data center and then having thresholds within it, tends to be a little more cut and dry, and it pulls anything that's even possibly a data center. It's going to pull that in, and there's not going to be the debate of, well, is it an edge? Is it a hyperscale? Because, again, those do vary depending on the user, the industry, the company. You know, different metrics and different standards all have sort of different ideas of what those mean, which is why we hesitated to define them. We did kind of start there and pulled back. But I see what you're saying. A campus would absolutely, you know, a campus, we would want that to fall under a data center, and it should meet the intensity levels that you all want. So is there any change to the initial vote on special exception? I think we're still trying to decide if
Can I
we
jump in real quick
Sure.
on this? How many of you who voted in favor of special exception only for in industrial think that maybe we could surmount a lot of your concerns through performance standards, which we haven't even got to yet? Performance standards for noise, performance standards for buffering and sighting, view sheds. We haven't even got to that yet. So again, I think it should be by right in industrial zoning with stringent standards, and we need to talk about those standards.
Is it something that you
Going to
that
capture
we'd
the
like to
smaller. That's naturally going to capture the smaller centers by virtue of the fact there isn't much industrial land without a rezoning. So I think we're back to the suggestion I've heard somewhere that we consider different criteria for different size center, which might make some sense.
maybe not different criteria, but a trigger,
exception
yeah, a special
versus
exception
by right.
trigger, yeah. So is there a desire to go through the other bullets before we make a final decision on the use?
Sure. We can circle back.
Um,
Hit some of these other points.
So, building appearance, right now, it's not really addressed in the language that's proposed in Article 7. We do have some language that is based on benchmark localities and industry research, pretty standard things for establishing the principal facade, establishing, also keep in mind that this would be next to existing residential or planned residential. So if it's platted, if it's designated or something, if it could be residential across the street next year and it's just not there now, we wanted to capture that. Not totally blanket, but if it's, on land use maps or has a plat that's going to be residential, that would apply. So adjacent neighborhoods and adjacent roads for that visual component. And then things like the differentiated surfaces, consistent design, fenestration. So that would be a little bit more of a aesthetic control that can be added with your consensus.
Yeah, I'm amenable with the recommended modification. Does anyone else have any?
I have no concern.
I'm good.
with it.
Good.
All right, then we go to height. Right now, there's nothing specific to data centers, but there is the underlying height regulations of the district. So we are proposing to specify that a little bit more. We are recommending allowing up to 60 feet. That would be over the 50 feet. But again, it would have that setback implication of for every foot over base height, the additional setback would be there. And that was to kind of capture the reality that sometimes these are tall. And so we wanted to give that provision for up to 60 feet.
But we don't have the ability to fight fire at 60 feet. We only have 2-story capability. 60 feet is more than 2 stories. So why would we change that until we have the capability?
Or by special exception, they could come in and offer a proffer for a ladder truck, and then we could go to 60 feet.
Or again, if there is discomfort with that level, we can say 35-foot base, special exception over 35 feet. And then that way.
Well, shouldn't an applicant have an opportunity to describe how they can take care of their own fire protection?
35 foot's gonna kill it.
Without relying on the county.
You probably have 8 to 10 foot of screening. 35 foot building is probably
Interior.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'd like to keep it at 35.
Okay, so I'm hearing keep it at 35, special exception above? Or do you want to just limit them completely at 35?
I guess.
As proposed in the new ordinance, it would be 35-foot base up to 50 feet. Up to 50 feet allowed. Doesn't need a special exception, but it does need to increase its setbacks 1 foot for every 1 foot above the base. Okay.
I think you put 35 feet due to our current fire suppression capabilities. So they know why. If they can fix it, then they can come in front of us.
Kind of
So
how I was looking at,
I'm sorry.
I was looking at chicken and an egg. They build it, the county should do okay, and we do know that the ladder truck is something that we have our eye on. So I could see it as a chicken and an egg. If it comes, get the ladder truck, have the ladder truck, then we could build higher. But I think the compromise would be if you put it in the ordinance, gives the opportunity for greater discussion.
So, I'm sorry, can we summarize again what the consensus is? So if we don't do anything, it would revert back to the set standard for the underlying district. So when we talk about this increase to 60, it would just be for data centers, theoretically. It wouldn't impact the underlying zoning. But I think I was hearing that we're comfortable leaving it at where the underlying zoning is and not making a special either
Correct.
greater height or lesser height than what would be proposed otherwise.
I believe so, but
Is that correct?
So we're saying stay at 35?
yes.
It'd be
Right. Be the base zoning.
35 up to 50 possible with the setback provision, and that's standard for anything in those districts.
I mean, with each story being 10 feet, that's, you're looking at a 3.5-story building. For now, I mean, Chief has never been shy about asking for things, so I know that a ladder truck would be coming at some point, but for now, I think that 35 should stay there.
Okay. And the 35 would be the same in either. It's really just the additional 10 feet with the setback provision. So just to drive it home, I'm hearing don't put the 60 feet in, leave it at the underlying standard already that's been proposed and discussed of 35-foot base and 50-foot max. All right. Screening, we do have some recommendations to clarify and beef up the screening language that we've already proposed by stating the ground-mounted mechanical equipment is prohibited in the front yard. Solid screening walls must be constructed with design materials and details and treatment compatible with those used on the nearest principal facade. And generally things that would match also the principal facade standards. The one thing being they perforated surfaces would obviously, may need to be allowable for the ventilation. But the enhanced screening would be on top of what's already there and would kind of tighten that up a little bit.
Do you mean screening meaning like vegetation, or this would be like a sound wall?
Yeah, I'm sorry. This is specifically in relation to the screening of the mechanical equipment, which is generally the big ticket item for screening outside of the overall perimeter screening. This would be screening specifically around, if there's an area where all of the HVAC and cooling systems are outside and the generators and things, they're used probably spaced all together on a pad outside of the building. This would require screening around that area or however many areas there may be.
Well, then
So
I have
more specific requirement than what's on the table. I think right now it does require some screening, but it doesn't specify that it needs to match the principal facade or be consistent, things like that. So it helps bring up the visual character and hopefully some sound attenuation as well.
That's what I was going to bring up, because when I visited one, I asked, could you put sound walls around the generators and the coolant systems if you're not on the, to buffer some of the sound? And they said that was possible, but so that would cover that, correct? Could you put that in there that you have to use soundproof walls? Sound like they would have it on a roadway.
Yeah, I think that's possible. We can specify engineered sound barriers.
Whatever the term for them is, like you
That's
have on a
some
highway
of
to
that
block.
might come naturally with the other noise ordinance or not noise, noise performance standard provisions. But if there is a specific performance standard that you want every data center to have engineered soundproofing around the mechanical equipment, we can look into adding that language.
So I think in general, you want the barrier for visual purposes, but when you have the sound attenuation, they utilize the barrier to get there. But just saying sound attenuation
I don't really care what it is, as long as they cut the noise level down.
I asked and they said that it was possible that they
Yeah.
could put it around it. And then my other question with the data center, we're just talking about a building. So with the data center, a lot of people don't know they come with substations because you have to, to generate the power. Would this screening and buffer and that only be for the building, or would it be what comes with it, like a substation?
The intention would be for anything mechanical would need to be screened. I'm trying to think if there's, let's see.
Yeah, I think when we went over this ordinance,
So we
that's
did
very
say
specifically what we said, is that anything mechanical outdoors was gonna have to be screened.
So we do already, as proposed, have the power generators, water cooling systems, storage facilities, and other mechanical infrastructure necessary for the operation of the data center shall be enclosed within a structure screened as to not be visible. So we already have that things like power generators need to be screened. We now have a little bit more specificity on the type of screening, and if we would like to incorporate engineered sound barrier elements into that screening, we can incorporate that.
I mean, and I asked about substation because one of the Prince William supervisors, who's very data center driven, that's one of the things said they regret is not putting that in place, that it screened the substations because they have them right on the road. And
So is there consensus to accept this with an added clause for engineered sound barriers?
Sure.
Okay, and then the buffers, again, this is similar to the solar discussion. As proposed, they are subject to buffers in the landscape ordinance. We can add some specificity so that the type C buffer, the most intense buffer, is utilized. So their options would be type C, the buffer berm, and that's pretty much it. It would remove any, not necessarily loopholes, but any lesser standards that could typically apply. The type B or A buffers would be off the table with this provision. Are we feeling good about type C buffers? And okay.
Screening unit substations also.
Adding some stations to. Yes, we can. I hear your question. Yeah, we can clarify to make sure that the mechanical equipment clause includes all of the items that are in the existing language, just to make sure that's consistent and not leaving anything out unintentionally. The intention would be to make sure that anything like that is screened. Okay, and then the floor area ratio, right now it's not addressed specifically for data centers. We can add in that the max would be 0.6. We didn't consider any special exception opportunities to get up above 0.6. We can add that if you'd like, but we think 0.6 is probably going to be sufficient for your needs. And of course, again, you can see where that lands and see what that actually looks like on a parcel. That is pretty much across the board with the other localities we looked at. Noise for data centers. And I guess I'll preface this by, a lot of this is going to mirror what we're going to talk about in noise. I wanted to address it specifically for data centers so that we can understand what can apply specifically to data centers. But when we get into noise, understand that if that's the direction you'd want to go by having an overall industrial noise standard, instead of being specific to data centers would be captured under that. But in a vacuum, if we don't have overall industrial standards, what we would propose for data centers. First of all, I guess to establish if that is where it needs to go, but I think maybe now looking at it, that question will be more applicable in the next section. But I was hearing earlier that we're comfortable with requiring the sound studies, requiring them at application before CO, and then ongoing to ensure it's not gradually increasing year to year. And then the other noise factor that we just talked about would be increasing that distance of the mechanical equipment, making sure that mechanical equipment specifically, as being the noise generator, has its own special setback in addition to any other setbacks. So I'm hearing consensus on these items. We're good with how it's proposed.
Do we want noise at the property line? I noticed there was, the other localities had decibels at the property line, right?
The intention would be at the property line, yeah, of the use.
Right. So 60, 55, or you're going to come up with those?
Yes, we'll get to that in the next section. Let me think, actually. Yeah, so we'll see what the decibel recommendations are in the industrial noise overall. But again, just keep in mind that the two big bucket options are, so you apply that to all industrial zones and uses, or we can take that and cater it and kind of put it in the specific industrial uses that you're thinking of. So just a quick summary of the research on industrial noise. Performance standards help reduce the impacts that are more intense in commercial and residential uses. The unit of measurement used in many noise and zoning ordinances is called the A-weighted decibel. It is slightly different than the basic decibel. There is a weighting component applied to it that makes it a little easier to use, and it is the unit recommended by the EPA and various model noise ordinances. Repeated exposure to noise levels over 70 dBA can be harmful over time. Decibel levels are logarithmic, which is important to keep in mind, meaning they don't increase in equal increments. So, and I mentioned that because as we start to get into thinking about, is 30 really that much more than 20? Is 50 really that much more than 40? So just think of it is logarithmic. 10 times more than 0 is going to be a 10 decibels. 100 times more is going to be 20, 1,000 times more will be 30, and so on. So as you get to certain decibel levels, if it doesn't feel like it's increasing equally, it's not. Maximum sound levels generally should be lower when adjacent or within a certain distance of existing or potential residential areas and other sensitive areas. Specifically, we're thinking schools and parks. We did see some research on, the recommended ambient decibel levels for schools that factor into quality learning environments and don't distract kids too much, kind of subconsciously with loud noises. Parks and recreation, wildlife preserves, things like that, ag areas that maybe where people are going to recreate or otherwise own land that they kind of wanted and expected to be quiet. And then up to a half-mile noise impact from industrial use was estimated in a benchmark locality. This is a little bit more empirical, but as you're reading about Prince William, we heard some of their citizens and some other people that submitted studies that kind of had this estimate of about a half mile. That's kind of where the complaints were being generated from. So we took that, we used that as sort of a starting standard for considering what is within a half mile. This graphic just gives you a little bit of an idea of what certain decibel levels are. It's helpful to have some examples in mind. And so as we're looking at decibel levels between 60 and 70 are typical for a lot of zoning uses and noise ordinances. That's about the level of conversation. City traffic is kind of in the high 70s, and you can see as it goes up from there. And then again, some of these, if they don't seem loud necessarily in conversation or casually or in passing, keep in mind that we're thinking continuous ongoing noise that wouldn't have any breaks to it in the environment. Some other considerations, nuisance noise ordinances and zoning-based performance standards address different issues and use different methods of enforcement. So it's appropriate for nuisance noise ordinances. It's okay for that to stay in the county code separate out of zoning ordinances. That's where you address things like loud parties at night, barking dogs at night, whatever it is that's identified as unacceptable, particularly at night, but sometimes during the day. It gives the sheriff or law enforcement authority over those provisions. That's what gives people the ability to call late at night and say, hey, there's something going on. Noise performance standards are better left for zoning to enforce. They tend to be more of an impact perspective, impacts of the use, impacts from what a use might generate on the community. And they can be catered to a particular use or to a district or both, depending on if you want something special for a certain use or if you are okay with the same thing applying to all industrial uses and zones. The community comparisons that were chosen were Town of Warrenton and Prince William County. Warrenton, for their regulation type, they put performance standards in the zoning ordinances for zoning uses, and they do have a separate nuisance noise ordinance. Prince William, right now, it's all within the nuisance noise ordinance in the county code. Their measurement procedures are fairly similar. Prince William's is a little bit more specific. That would be that the sound levels are measured by type 1 and type 2 meters, meeting ANSI specs. That is typical, and that would be the acceptable range that we found. Calibration provisions, microphone positioning, and sighting criteria are specified. So it just helps with that consistency. There's a lot of arguments that can say where you should take it, but at the end of the day, we need to pick one place to take the measurement and have that be the same place for everywhere or for every use. And then we are going with property line measurements, and it would be measured at the property line on the side impacted by the noise. So presumably there may need to be sound studies on all of the property lines to make sure that we understand what the noise implications are on all sides. These are the tables of decibel levels that are used in Warrenton and Prince William. Prince William's is maybe more modern. It does use the A-weighted decibel, which is why it doesn't need to take frequency into account. Residential and mixed use, being that there may be residential and mixed use, obviously we'll have the lowest permissible decibels with 60 during the day, 55 at night. This does vary a little bit in some other places in research that we did, but for the most part, 60 seems on the mark and acceptable. And then the other provisions for commercial and industrial were relatively consistent with other research. Recommendations coming out of this, first and foremost, keep your nuisance noise ordinance where it is. Maybe you need to update that in its own right, but we would recommend keeping that separate from the performance standards. And so provide those general noise standards for industrial districts and uses in Article 8. And then should there be use-specific noise standards, that would go in Article 7, and we can cater things more specifically to certain uses. And then, of course, measurement procedures should be addressed, including the measuring equipment, the calibration, testing location, and other controls. And then, again, we have this sound steady theme popping back up. So upon application, that would be, we're thinking for rezoning, special exceptions, or major site plans. Because again, this would be just industrial in general. So we, there could be things that are by right, but they do require a major site plan. And then again, after construction and prior to issuance of the CO to confirm compliance, and then annually to ensure ongoing compliance. The decibel ranges in the area that would be impacted, we considered adjacent, but we actually wanted to make sure that we didn't create loopholes where if an industrial use is going in and the parcel next door is residential, or excuse me, the parcel next door is not residential, but maybe it's a small parcel, and on the other side of that is a neighborhood. So we went with the half-mile radius, or we went with the radius approach in general and chose a half-mile as a starting point based on what we were hearing from those empirical, complaints about where people were hearing noise. Approximately maybe up to a half-mile was impacted. So we wanted that as a starting point, meaning if an industrial use is going in, or if it's an industrially zoned property or an industrial use as identified in the use matrix, we would look at that parcel, go out a half-mile and see, is there an agricultural district or a residential district within that half-mile? Or if there's no districts, are there residential or agricultural uses as stated in the use matrix? Or are there future land uses that are residential or agricultural? And then other future residential, such as plats. We also wanted to make sure that if it goes on the, near the border, that if it goes over and there's a neighborhood in the next jurisdiction that's within a half-mile, that that's captured. And then we also wanted to capture those sensitive uses in areas that we were initially thinking of, places that kind of build on quiet ambient nature, campgrounds, schools, parks, churches, wildlife preserves, things like that. So if an industrial use has one of these within a half-mile, then at the industrial property line, it needs to have a maximum of 60 decibels during the daytime and 55 at night. And that is what those sound studies would need to confirm. Then if within a half-mile it's only commercial, it ups a little bit to 65 and 60. And if it's only surrounded by industrial within a half-mile, then they can go up to 79 and 72 for daytime and nighttime. These are, this map shows a little bit of the industrial zone properties, with the yellow being a quarter-mile buffer and the blue being a half-mile. So we wanted to show the full range of what a half-mile would be, and we do have, I can flip back and forth as needed. But then also think if someone were to rezone industrial, it would also, upon the rezoning, trigger this half-mile or whatever radius you end up at. Would trigger that. So it's not saying it can't go in, it is saying if it's within those, if one of these things is within that buffer, then you'd go to the table and that's your sound limit. And that would apply to the existing things that are there. Of course, if a neighborhood comes in afterwards and builds next to a data center, it wouldn't be appropriate to retroactively make the data center then meet that. If right now, just theoretically, if they only had commercial around and then a neighborhood goes in. But at the time of the, at the time of the theoretical approval, they would need to meet those levels at the time of application. And we can come back to this as needed if there's a specific area in question. So the first major question here is, does the board desire control of all industrial related noise in a way that would go into Article 8 as a performance standard for anything zoned or identified as an industrial use? Or if you're only having things like data centers in mind, and you don't want every industrial use to come through this, we can take all of this and put it towards the exact uses that you want.
I think I'd like to see it probably at the level of the industrial zoning level. So using those numbers in that situation, personally.
I concur. Same across the board.
If we need to make changes down the road, we can start addressing it for individual
I
industries.
think that's where we were going towards, but we did want to be sensitive to the fact that if there was an industrial use that we weren't thinking of, that it is possible to ID the things that you want, but if you're comfortable with it going into Article 8, then that would mean the things that we talked about before, especially in the data center stuff there, it would be subject to it. You just won't see it in Section 7, you'd see it in Section 8. And so from there, does the half-mile radius suit?
Mr. Myers, I think, has a question.
I have a couple of quick questions.
Sure.
One is river is not necessarily a park. Is that counted as, I guess that's a wildlife area? I don't know. We need to check that. The next thing is, I don't think we have any industrial property that's not within a half mile of some kind of residential or agricultural. So should we just make it the one standard? I don't think there's anywhere else. I was looking at her map, and every one I saw would be something to check. If everyone is within a half mile, then we probably should just make the one standard.
I agree with you. We have so little industrial that I don't think we're going to have a big enough plot that you're going to have a situation where, like, hey, it could get up to that level. But I guess at the end of the day, if it were to ever happen, then it's there in place.
I think that was the thought. When we looked at it, we saw that it was.
I don't think it hurts
pretty
to give you
dense
that
around
granularity.
And the third thing is there anybody that would need to be grandfathered if we do it across the board for industrial? And for instance, the dump right now, I know, has backup alarms and things like that you can hear for quite a ways. I guess they could change that or make them quieter. Just something to think about.
And really, it would only apply going forward. That said, if an existing use were to expand or come back and they triggered a special exception or triggered something new, then that could be a trigger for some of these things. It would probably depend.
They would have to comply with the new ordinance, though.
Not if they didn't make any changes. If they make substantial changes, that might be a trigger to bring them into compliance. But if they were existing now and it was approved, this ordinance wouldn't impact them until they moved or did something that triggered it. But it would impact anything new going forward.
There would be no noise policing on this.
Outside of the
I imagine
nuisance
you're going to
noise
have whatever department. No. Okay.
And that's pretty typical of any ordinance provision.
Can you give me the definition of calibration? Are you talking about calibration of the meter or
of the meter?
of a-
Yeah, and there are
I'm not
some
talking about establishing a baseline
just
pre-development.
calibration of the actual meter to make sure that before they do the test, it's kind of is meeting some consistent standards. And there are some standards out there for how to do that. So we just wanted to make sure that that was left, or that wouldn't be left out. I think, for example, in the case of Warrenton, they have needs to be a meter that is in compliance with ANSI, but it doesn't specify the type and it doesn't specify calibration. So we just wanted to make sure that that all of your noise studies would be conducted in the same way.
Who would keep the calibrations? Who would be responsible for that?
The sound tester, the engineer.
So
that would be, all of those stats would need to be confirmed and documented in some way, yes.
So if there was a summons issued for the sound, and then in court they challenged the calibration, that means that that person that did that test would have to go to court. So every machine that has a calibration and you go to court, you have to prove your calibration. So that would be the same with the sound for anything. So I need to know what their responsibilities are, of who keeps it, who's responsible, and all those type of things.
The idea would be that confirmation would all need to be submitted as part of the study. And so any measures taken to get that, to get there.
I was talking about enforcement. So if someone's out of compliance with and there's an enforcement done.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
So there has to be.
Yeah, I think that onus would be on, or I'm sorry, is that Rebecca?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, if it's your enforcement officer, I think you were talking about, a new position, and so if it's your county staff that's going out and just kind of making a check and saying, oh, you're out of compliance, and whatever device that they are using, yes, the county is responsible for making sure that that is calibrated and operating properly before they make a citation related to noise violation.
And then so as part of the ongoing sound studies that would be supplied to you in terms of complaint based, it could be that the zoning enforcement officer has that equipment owned by the county, or in that case, a third party is contracted to come in and do the test.
So that still didn't give me any provisions for the calibration and responsibility, but you can go ahead, keep going.
I believe the responsibility would ultimately be on the county if they're the ones taking the meter out. And then, yeah, records of the calibration process would need to be kept.
So when, if the calibration becomes a question for the first initial before it's approved, where's the responsibility lie there?
So that would be part of, so if it's part of the sound study and that
You have to use a calibrated meter and the calibration, who's responsible? Make sure that that's calibrated properly and within the standards, and there's a record, and it's memorialized.
So the records would need to be kept by the county, and then by having a credentialed professional, it's similar to we don't take plans without an engineer seal. It would need to be someone that is a sound engineer and that is signing off on that with his credential.
So why would the county want to be responsible for someone else's work in the calibration when they didn't have a visual calibration themselves? You're putting the county in a precarious situation if they're going to be responsible for a third party's work. So we can go through this later because what do they calibrate?
I think they would be, I mean, if a professional fails to perform their duty, if our ordinance says it must be calibrated, then there's a question that comes up later that, the sound study is done, the guy said, this is the value, and then we get a complaint or some other enforcement action. We go back to the engineering firm or the developer and say, show us our records. And if they have failed to capture the data required by the ordinance, then they've made a false official statement, or then
it becomes very problematic because the county becomes on the hook for a third party. And as you heard one of the speakers talk about the science for hire. So if the county is responsible for somebody else's calibration, the county needs to be responsible for their own calibration. So if we're going to
right, but Heather sends out inspectors that are independent contractors who use instruments and
I think that we're
measurements.
blurring the lines a little bit. I think one is the sound. I'm sorry, it's getting late. My brain's not working anymore. But the sound study that comes in beforehand is done by a professional. The code enforcement officer has same as a speed radar detector, goes out and takes that measurement, and we would be responsible for that calibration of our own tools.
Right. So
if a third party sound study were submitted and it was challenged and proven in court that it was not done properly, then that means the submittal requirements haven't been met. The use wouldn't be able to continue until they had a legal sound study that is kosher across the board. So again, there's this, and that idea also comes into play with anything that needs to be done by a credentialed professional. If someone comes in and we realize their seal is outdated or otherwise invalid, then that impacts the validity of the plan in the same way that if this were to happen and something got challenged and that study wasn't legally corroborated, then it sounds like the applicant would need to get a sound study before they would be able to continue the use.
So we're dependent upon someone else's calibration that will be accurate, but then we're going to depend on our own calibration. So
If there would, if your process ends up being that you choose to send a zoning officer with county-owned equipment, then yes, the calibration as the person giving the test, those records would need to be kept and originate with the county. If you're getting a third-party study, I would expect that those would be part of the stamped and sealed study. And then if that individual is proven to be fraudulent, that individual is fraudulent, and a new sound study would need to be conducted.
I think about the health department and the thermometer, if they check your dishwasher.
I just caution all y'all that this is going to be another one of those boxes.
Another avenue that has
Watch
been
that when
used.
a developer is denied the sound study, that he doesn't automatically challenge the calibrations.
The other, there is an example of, instead of having the third party do, or having the applicant submit the sound study, we can have all of the same study requirements, but it would be that the applicant reimburses the county to do it. So then county staff would hire, instead of just having an approved list, it would actually be the county staff coordinating the sound study. Still not necessarily doing the calibration in terms of the sound studies. But that would be maybe one way to have a little bit more control. It would add a little bit more work for that staff, but in terms of monetary reimbursement, it would be reimbursed by the applicant, and then the county itself would get those studies. That was done in at least one locality.
I think Mr. Collins was interested, Ms. Lackey, if you had any input on liability, I guess, from the county perspective.
Calibration and the different, the enforcement, and also that we know that it's the calibration issue. A proceeding, it's calibration.
So if the report is prepared by a third party, the county would not have liability. But an engineer would have to certify that that was proper. So they'd be kind of putting their license on the line. So, one would hope that those would be legitimate studies. That's certainly I think a small industry, a small subset of people who take pride in their work. And I think, the likelihood of that being fraudulent would be unlikely. But secondarily, the code enforcement officer could verify things with proper training and proper equipment. Of course, as you pointed out, in order to enforce, you'd have to make sure that all of that equipment was properly and regularly calibrated.
Okay, so I think the last thing that we decided across the board was Article 8. Moving into the radius, first of all, does the radius approach work for you? And then from there, is half mile meeting the needs of your community?
I think so. As Mr. Myers mentioned, I think they'll all end up hitting it because they'll all be within that range anyways. So,
okay, so
I think that's
so
fine.
half mile is fine. Okay.
Okay with that.
And then are there any districts, designations, or uses that should be added or removed to the proposed table? And that, again, would be here. So is there anything basically to that, the main box there with 60 and 55, would there be Is there anything there that gives you heartburn? Is there anything there that needs to come off? Anything that needs to be added? We did try and start with as much as we could think of to capture it all. That could very well be where it should stay. We have heard that those are the areas with the most complaints and the most desire to be protected generally.
I just have one question. I know that I just looked at the list, campground. What about on like a nursing home or a hospital setting? Would that fall under?
It would depend on if it's a residential use in the use matrix, and I'd have to refresh my memory on that. But uses tends to capture all of the residential, maybe not a hospital, because that's not.
I just wondered because we have a nursing home that would be, they would be sensitive to that kind of noise, you know,
So we just
more
wanna-
than a regular.
We can double check. So I'm hearing if nursing home isn't already captured, to make sure that it's captured.
Yes, we call it life care facility, and it is under the residential uses.
We need to consider the base federal land, or
In what way do you mean by consider the base?
if we place a nuisance, a noise emitting thing near a base location, I'm sure there are methods to deconflict those kinds of uses, but it's the only thing I can think of that's in the county that hasn't been captured by the list that you created.
Well, they make a lot of noise.
So I'm hearing noise is generated from the base.
Yeah.
They make
Well, they're
tons of
already
noise.
existing, so this wouldn't apply to anything they're already doing. And then if it would depend on if they're
Are you worried about impact to the base by this? Okay.
to the base.
I understand. You're right. It is outside. I would imagine, though, this would still probably fall under the first subheading, because I think we probably have A1, A2, A3, R1, R2, R3, all within a half mile of any of those locations as well. I mean, like right by A gate, you have residential. I would imagine.
Okay. So I didn't hear any specific changes because we have nursing homes already covered. Base is probably naturally protected around it through the other uses. So we're comfortable with how it's proposed.
I think that's the general consensus.
Okay.
Okay.
And then for the proposed decibel levels, that's the 60 daytime, 55 nighttime. Is there a consensus there?
I think we should be defining nighttime and daytime a little more tightly.
Like time, like
7
hours from this
yeah,
hour to that hour.
8 p.m.,
So
5 a.m., something like that.
Okay. So I hear 8 p.m. and 5 p.m. Is that a good, or 8 p.m. and 5 a.m.?
So our current ordinance for noise goes from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. for, I guess, daytime hours, and then 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. for nighttime. Now we can use different ones. Just what we currently have is that those are the ranges.
Those work for me.
So we can do it to match the other existing noise ordinance. Okay.
I'd like to see nighttime lower on A1 through MU, like 40.
So so you're saying decrease the nighttime decibels below 55. I think at some point our concern with going below that is that possible? We didn't want to make it so that it's so low that there's not anything that can naturally hit that level. And so 55 is what we were seeing as the nighttime standard generally for residential. There may be some variation, but 55 seemed like a good landing spot. So we can lower it, but I do think we run the risk of starting to wonder, is that possible to hit it if it's below 55?
Do you have that chart?
And then-
Yeah, 40's like rustling leaves or something.
goodness.
So essentially, ambient noise is what you're saying. And so and again, that's being measured at the property.
At the industrial, so it also, yeah, that's important to keep in mind. We're talking about as measured at the uses property line. So it adds naturally some more distance, because we're not saying if it's in a residential neighborhood down the street, it needs to be 60 there. It would need to be 60 during the daytime on its own property line and 55 at its own property line. And yeah, the idea would be if there is something, it's not necessarily next door, but it's just down the street, by confirming it on their own property, it does kind of naturally add a little bit more distance.
I think I would stay with the 55.
Go one more slide to the cycling.
I'm sorry, which?
One more the other way, to the cycling, where it was telling the cycling noise. Right there.
So that's
And that had to
coming
do with the
here.
DBA.
So the first table is showing unweighted decibels. That's where it is taking into account where basically the lower the frequency, the higher the base decibel tends to be heard. Lower frequencies, essentially this is saying lower frequencies can be a little louder. Higher frequencies, that really high pitched stuff, needs to be much more capped. The idea going into this, number one, it's a more difficult standard to calibrate, to test, all of that. You need to bring in some more equipment, more considerations. Also, data centers, some of the sound engineering reports coming out of that, data centers generally operate at a low frequency. Low frequencies are generally more difficult to attenuate. So if some of our biggest industrial concerns are naturally lower frequency emitters, if we go with that sliding scale, we're actually going to be letting things like data centers be a little bit louder. So the A-weighted decibel takes into account that frequency aspect. And of course, it is, at the end of the day, these are all kind of estimates. There are other weighted decibels, but this tends to be the standard that most correctly reflects what you're hearing at a point. The actual volume of sound after adjusting for frequency.
It's going to keep it. So it's a droning noise that is part of the issue. The cycling things. So I don't know. They're I don't know where it is.
Well, they don't specify it in that way. That's part of one of the things that they're discussing, and Prince William had to interpret this, because this again is in the nuisance noise ordinance, so it's enforced differently. It falls under a lot of different types of
We should go to like the 50 or something at nighttime, because you know it's your question. Yeah. Somewhere it's a little.
If there's consensus, we can drop that to 50.
Sure, go ahead.
How's everyone feel?
I agree.
Again, keep in mind that that is in kind of derived from an older standard before the A-weighted decibel. 60 and 50. Okay. Under the DBA standard, it would just be straight up 50 dBA at nighttime as specified after 10 p.m.
Right.
Okay. And then, again, we've already kind of touched base on measurement procedures, but right now, there's really nothing in the data center proposed language that touches on it. We wanted to make sure that we're adding in similar provisions. There are some sort of set standards and model ordinances for the meters. It's recommended type 1 and type 2. And other things that are basically derived from the ANSI standards, so that there is something that you can reference that is out there that's across the board and that many people use. And so the measurement language isn't in this slide, but basically it was very similar to what was in Prince William. If that's okay with you guys, then we can move on from that one. And then the sound studies, again, we're talking before rezoning, special exception, or major site plan to confirm anticipated levels. By adding in the major site plan, that would presumably capture future by right industrial uses, just to make sure that, you know, things other than data centers might also be allowed, and always consider there's, you know, if this ordinance lives on for several years, there are uses that we might not even know about that could come up. So that's one of the helpful things about putting it in industrial standards. And then again, after construction prior to CO, and then annually. And as proposed, that would be the applicant providing that study with the credentials that are approved by the zoning administrator. And as proposed, we do have that the zoning administrator does have some control over who they would accept. Okay. That wraps it up for the specifics.
Already?
But yeah, if there's any other questions or things we didn't touch on, we'd be happy to answer any additional questions. All right. Then I'll let Rebecca kick back in just for some wrap up of the next steps.
Yeah, so just if you can give me one more click, it'll show us all the things that have been accomplished thus far. And then our next session is going to be May 30th, and we will be talking about power plants and battery storage at that meeting. And so after that, it's going to wrap up all of the items that you asked us to dive deeper in. We will incorporate the edits as you direct for those topics. And then we can set the open house for the public to review, provide feedback. I'm anticipating that would be June, July timeframe. And then after that, we would have 2 additional work sessions to talk about what we hear from the public. And incorporate any of edits that come from that, and then we could move into public hearings, which would likely be November timeframe. And so that's it. Thank you for all your discussion and your guidance tonight.
Mr. Collins, did you have something?
Yeah, so that schedule you had up there, there was no time to talk about the rest of the ordinances. All the other revisions.
No time to talk about what?
There's no other time to talk about the rest of the updates.
Mr. Collins, could
Yes,
you
ma'am.
use your mic so Rebecca can hear you at home, sir? Thank you.
There's no time up there to talk about the rest of the zoning ordinances. There's no.
So the rest of the zoning ordinance, yes, will be talked about after the public open house. So once we hear the public feedback, we will look at the ordinance in its entirety, and you all can readdress anything that you would like to at that point, and have it finalized and ready for public hearing.
So that would be the pre-adoption work sessions is what you're saying.
Yes, there's 2 of those.
Understood. Thank you.
And I think
When we do
I know,
the-
Mr. Collins, you had indicated you have a lot of questions, and so I think that's what Mr. Granger and Ms. Cobb were referring to. That's the period of time. Obviously, that's a schedule that we're hoping to commit to, but if it has to go more, it has to go more. I mean, there may be citizens that want to come and participate in that process too, so.
Well, I think that we need to discuss some of these in another meeting besides after the open house and have a review in one night. I think that we need to have a review before we get to that part. There's a lot of things I think that everybody wants to talk about.
So I imagine that'd be a change order would be my guess if we're asking for another meeting.
We don't have to have them.
Okay. Oh, you're just saying just a board work session. Okay.
Could be a joint work session between both.
I listened to all their sessions on the re-up, and I had some questions of what y'all agreed upon, and I'd like to have another. I'd like to have so we can talk.
Okay.
About it.
Then I'll ask Mr. Miller, and I guess we could either try to hammer it out now since we're all are here, or we could have staff maybe try to coordinate.
My recommendation
for
would
them
be
at work.
get through the public open house to hear that feedback, then perhaps schedule a joint meeting during that kind of pre-adoption work sessions is what I think. Would that be satisfactory, Mr. Collins?
I would think we want to do that before the open house. I think we'd want to review some of these things before we got to the open house. Because once you get to the open house, you're on the way downhill. There's not much time left.
Then that would have to be the last meeting in June, correct?
I think the intentions of Berkeley Group was to get all of the feedback and make one revision to cut down on that change order.
So,
It
like I
was the
said, we
thought
don't need
process.
the Berkeley Group for a joint meeting. We don't need them there to review it. They can watch it online if they want to.
Just keep in mind that those revisions won't be captured until the final revisions.
Right.
Ms. Collins, if you put everything down on email and send it to them?
No, I will not. It's too complex. And I need to have open discussion with the planning commission, not just one of them on the side somewhere, and not just me, what the board does with the rest of these ordinances.
I'll ask the planning commissioner, are you amenable to entertaining a joint work session just between the two boards? Obviously not including the Berkeley Group, just to discuss your work and efforts that you've put in and any questions we may have.
I am.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Moss.
We are.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, ma'am.
So I'm confused. Would we not already be part of the pre-adoption work sessions in August and September?
We are.
And could we not then, I know tonight we set this meeting up separately outside of our calendar, but could we, the Board of Supervisors, not ask the Planning Commission if they're doing these work sessions during their normal meeting schedule, when they're not having public hearings or whatnot, could we not go to their meeting that time? Because wouldn't they be there, the Berkeley Group be there at their work session?
I assume Berkeley Group's planning to be at the pre-adoption work sessions in August. Okay, there we go.
So they're already scheduled to be there, so we wouldn't need a change order to add another meeting is what I'm saying, because every one of these is another $3,600 or whatever. So if they're already going to be there, why don't we go to those? I actually have a lot of confidence in the public that many of the issues that we're seeing and hearing about are going to come out during the public open house and review in June and July as well. And I just wouldn't want to have a meeting, a joint meeting between the two boards and not have the consultant there to capture the consensus and then to make the changes gearing up to the final revisions.
So for clarification, that pre-adoption work sessions, it's 2 of those, and they are slated to be joint. We want everyone at the table together to hear what the public has responded in terms of their review, as well as for everyone to be able to say, hey, I've read through this again. Here's some things, that I'm not comfortable with, or let's talk about this. So those two sessions are meant to be both bodies talking, about what the public has had to say about what you have thought in terms of your review. And that's the time to fine tune it, and we can incorporate all edits before we get into public hearing phase.
Thank you.
And we still have a draft ordinance work session from before that we missed, correct? There's no yellow check mark.
That's not checked because it's got a sub item. It's these two joint work sessions from May 30th. So we've got the May 30th session that we will have, and then we will check off that draft ordinance session.
I think that's to capture all the different work sessions that. All right. I know that the Planning Commission still has one more piece of business to take care of, but I believe our time with you is at an end, and I would like to thank you guys for this joint meeting, and thank the Berkeley Group as well. Really appreciate everyone coming together to get this done. So thank you. But with that, I will entertain, unless there's any other business, I'll entertain a motion.
I make a motion. Oh.
Hello, everyone. This is Thomas Hastings, NSA South Potomac. Good evening. It was really interesting to sit through this and hear everyone's discussion. Really kind of admirable, everyone working together. So commendations to all. Just wanted to ask when sort of the military overlay is going to be included, which part of this process.
So, Mr. Hastings, I appreciate you being here. I really do. But at this point, this isn't an engagement like that. So if you have questions, please shoot an email. But there was an opportunity for public comment, and that period is over. And so I apologize, but to run the meeting properly and effectively, we just can't have interruptions. So please email any concerns or questions you have. We can work to address and answer those questions for you. But thank you.
All right, well, let me start again. But I'd like to make a motion to adjourn the Board of Supervisors till Thursday, April 27th at 6 p.m. here in the boardroom.
Second.
I have a motion properly seconded. Do I have any discussion? All in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Chair votes aye. Motion carries. We are adjourned.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. Very.
I knew coming in.
Yeah, they're all leaving. All right, so we're gonna just jump in here with old business.
Yep.
Hey, excuse me, we haven't adjourned yet?
Mr. Fox, we're still rolling.
We haven't adjourned yet? You don't need that. Lop that off.
Hey, y'all, we still got a meeting going on.
Mr. Fox, excuse me.
Hey, y'all.
Gentlemen.
Seriously, I'd like to go home at some point. So can y'all wrap this up? Can we end this sidebar over here? Because we got a meeting to go.
Yeah, we haven't adjourned. Okay, so we have an old business matter.
Yes,
Yep.
as you've been advised by county attorney, I think you have a motion to make.
Yep, and I'll take care of that. So in light of what has been determined by the county attorney to be a tie vote arising from voting action on case number 23-02-Z01 by a commissioner with an expired term on April 11th, I move to renew the issue of a recommendation on this matter as a non-public hearing item for the May 9th agenda prior to the referral to the Board of Supervisors.
We have a motion. Do we have a second? All in favor? Thank you. All right, with that, we have a motion to adjourn. Second? We have a second. All in favor?
I'm sorry, I got a little bit confused. And I thought that motion was simply to.
It's so we can.
So that vote
revote.
was actually to vote on the
You'll revote at your next meeting.
next meeting.
Yes.
Okay.
We voted not to send this.